The summer sun beat down on Redemption Creek like the wrath of an angry god. Heat shimmered off the dirt road that ran through the center of the Arizona town, distorting the view of the wooden buildings that lined either side. But the townsfolk weren't looking at the buildings today. All eyes were fixed on the wooden post in the center of the town square. Eleanor Winters stood tied to the post, her wrists bound with rough rope that bit into her skin. Her golden hair had come loose from its pins and fell in tangled strands around her face, partially obscuring the bruise forming on her left cheek. Her blue dress, once pristine and proper, was now stained with dirt and tomato juice from the vegetables that had been thrown at her. But it wasn't her disheveled appearance that captured attention. It was her eyes. While her body was bound, her gaze remained defiant, ice blue and unflinching as she stared back at the crowd. Preacher Abraham Pierce stood before her, his tall, gaunt frame casting a long shadow across the dirt. His voice boomed across the square, carrying to even those who lingered at the edges of the crowd, uncertain about this public display of punishment. Eleanor Winters has defied not just the will of her guardian, but the will of God himself. Pierce's face flushed red with righteous indignation as he spoke. She has refused the blessed union with brother Raymond Blackwood, a union that would secure her future and bring her wayward soul back to the light. A few murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Raymond Blackwood stood near the front, his expensive suit setting him apart from the simpler attire of most townsfolk. At 50, his hair was more salt than pepper, and the corners of his mouth turned down in what appeared to be disappointment. But there was something else in his eyes as he watched Eleanor, something possessive and cold that had nothing to do with spiritual concern. The Blackwood name had once commanded respect throughout the territory. His father had built an empire in silver mining, amassing a fortune that Raymond had largely squandered on failed ventures and increasingly desperate gambles. Only a select few in Redemption Creek knew that behind his facade of wealth lay mounting debts and impending ruin. The silver in Thomas Winters' land represented his final chance to restore the Blackwood legacy, a legacy he'd promised his dying father he would preserve at any cost. His desperation made him dangerous in ways that mere greed could not. The scripture teaches us that rebellious children must be disciplined, Pierce continued, holding his Bible aloft as though it were a shield. Proverbs tells us, foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child, but the rod of correction will drive it far from him. Eleanor's jaw tightened, but she remained silent. She had learned long ago that words were useless against her uncle's selective interpretation of scripture. The desert wind whipped around her, carrying dust that stung her eyes, but she refused to blink, refused to show weakness. 3 hours at the shame post, Pierce announced to the town. May this time of reflection bring her to repentance. As he turned to walk away, Mrs. Collins, the baker's wife, stepped forward hesitantly. Preacher, it's nearly noon. The sun will remind her of the fires of hell that await the disobedient, Pierce finished coldly. God's judgment is not tempered by comfort, Sister Collins. The crowd began to disperse, some casting sympathetic glances toward Eleanor, others averting their eyes in tacit approval of her punishment. Pierce took Blackwood's arm and led him toward the church, their heads bent in conversation. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, allowing herself one moment of respite from the sun's punishing rays. Her throat was parched, her skin already beginning to burn. 3 hours in this heat might not kill her, but it would come close. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her open her eyes again. A large black stallion came into view, kicking up dust as it trotted down the main street. Its rider sat tall in the saddle, shoulders broad beneath a dusty leather vest. A worn cowboy hat shaded his face, but she could see the strong line of his jaw, the set of his mouth as he surveyed the scene before him. The stranger pulled his horse to a stop near the post. For a long moment, he simply sat there, looking at Eleanor with eyes that reminded her of a mountain lake, deep, clear, and unreadable. Then, without a word, he swung down from the saddle. He was tall, taller than most men in Redemption Creek, and moved with the easy confidence of someone who had spent his life in the saddle. His clothes bore the dust of many miles, but there was nothing rough about the way he approached her. "What's your crime?" he asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Eleanor wet her cracked lips before answering. "Refusing to marry a man 3 times my age." Something flashed in the stranger's eyes, a spark of anger quickly controlled. He glanced around, noting the few townsfolk who still lingered, watching with curious eyes. "That's not a crime where I come from," he said, reaching for the knife at his belt. "It's called having sense, yum." Before she could respond, he had cut through the ropes binding her to the post. Eleanor stumbled forward, her legs weak from standing so long in the heat. The stranger caught her arm, steadying her with a gentleness that belied his rough appearance. "What do you think you're doing?" The voice of Sheriff Jenkins cut through the murmurs of the remaining onlookers. The portly lawman hurried toward them, one hand resting on his holstered gun. The stranger didn't release Eleanor's arm. "Preventing a death from heat stroke," he answered calmly. "Or was that the intention?" Jenkins's face reddened. "This is town business, stranger. That girl is being disciplined by order of Preacher Pierce. Your preacher ordered a young woman tied to a post in 100-degree heat?" The stranger's voice remained even, but Eleanor felt his hand tense on her arm. "Seems more like torture than discipline to me." "You best move on, mister," Jenkins warned. "We don't take kindly to outsiders interfering in our affairs." The stranger's free hand moved to rest casually on his gun belt. "And I don't take kindly to seeing women treated like criminals for making their own choices." The tension in the air was palpable. Eleanor could feel the rapid beating of her heart, the dryness in her throat intensifying with each passing second. She wasn't sure if this man was her salvation or about to get them both shot. "What is the meaning of this?" Preacher Pierce's voice cut through the standoff as he strode back into the square, Blackwood at his heels. "Who dares interfere with God's justice?" The stranger turned to face the approaching men, positioning himself slightly in front of Eleanor. "I'm Gabriel Montana," he said, his voice carrying across the square. "And where I come from, tying women to posts isn't justice, it's cruelty." Pierce drew himself up to his full height, though he still fell short of the stranger's imposing frame. "This is my niece, and she is under my authority. You have no right." "Actually," Gabriel interrupted, "I do." He reached into his vest and pulled out a folded document. "I hold legal title to the northern property that once belonged to Thomas Winters. I've come to claim what's mine." The color drained from Pierce's face so quickly that Eleanor thought he might faint. Blackwood stepped forward, his features contorted with anger. "That's impossible," Blackwood spat. "That land belongs to the church now." Gabriel unfolded the document, holding it out. "The deed says otherwise. Signed by Thomas Winters himself, witnessed and notarized in Phoenix 3 weeks before his death. I'm happy to show it to the county judge if there's any question." Eleanor stared at the stranger in shock. Her father had sold land before he died, and to this man, it didn't make sense. Her father had been devoted to the church, or so she had always been told. Pierce's hands trembled as he snatched the document, his eyes scanning it frantically. This could be a forgery," he stammered, but the fear in his voice betrayed his recognition of its authenticity. "Take it to the judge, then," Gabriel suggested mildly. "In the meantime, I'll be escorting Miss Winters somewhere she can recover from her discipline." "You will do no such thing," Pierce hissed. "Eleanor is my ward until she marries. The law is quite clear on that matter." Gabriel's expression hardened. "The law is also clear on abuse. I wonder what the territorial governor would think of a preacher who ties young women to posts in the desert sun." A crowd had begun to gather again, drawn by the confrontation. Eleanor could see the calculation in her uncle's eyes as he assessed the situation, his authority challenged in front of his congregation. "Eleanor," Pierce said, his voice softening to the honeyed tone he used in sermons, "come home now. This man is a stranger, possibly dangerous. I only want what's best for you." Eleanor felt a lifetime of obedience pulling at her, the instinct to bow her head and follow him home strong after years of conditioning. But the memory of the ropes cutting into her wrists was stronger. The prospect of marriage to Blackwood, of his hands on her body, his breath on her face, was unthinkable. "I think I'll stay with Mr. Montana for now, Uncle," she said, her voice hoarse but steady, "since he seems to be the only one concerned about whether I live or die today." Pierce's face twisted with rage, the mask of fatherly concern dropping away. "You ungrateful, sinful girl! After all I've done for you!" "That's enough," Gabriel cut in, his hand moving to rest on his gun. "The lady has made her choice. Unless you want this to get ugly, preacher, I suggest you back down." For a tense moment, Eleanor thought her uncle might actually attack Gabriel. Consequences be damned. But Blackwood placed a restraining hand on Pierce's arm. "Let it go, Abraham," Blackwood murmured, though his eyes remained fixed on Eleanor with that same possessive gleam. "There are other ways to handle this." Pierce shook with barely contained fury, but he allowed Blackwood to pull him back. "This isn't over," he promised, pointing a finger at Eleanor. "You'll come crawling back when you see what life is like without the protection of God's church. And you," he turned to Gabriel, "will regret the day you set foot in Redemption Creek." With that, he turned on his heel and stalked away, Blackwood following after one last lingering look at Eleanor that made her skin crawl. Gabriel watched them go, his expression unreadable. When they were out of earshot, he turned to Eleanor. "Can you walk?" he asked quietly. She nodded, though in truth her legs felt weak beneath her. "Where are we going?" "Somewhere safe," he replied, leading her toward his horse. "Do you have anyone in town you trust? Family? Friends?" Eleanor thought of the townsfolk who had watched her punishment without intervention, of the years she'd spent isolated by her uncle's strict rules. There was only one person who had ever shown her genuine kindness. "My aunt," she said, "my mother's sister, Martha Coleman. She lives at the edge of town, but my uncle forbids me to see her." A slight smile tugged at the corner of Gabriel's mouth. "Your uncle seems to forbid a lot of things. Let's go see your aunt." He helped her onto his horse, then mounted behind her. Eleanor was acutely aware of his solid presence at her back, his arm around her waist to steady her. It was the closest she'd been to a man who wasn't family, and despite her exhaustion, she felt a strange flutter in her stomach and at the contact. As they rode slowly through town, Eleanor could feel the stares of the townsfolk, could almost hear the whispers that would spread like wildfire. By sundown, everyone in Redemption Creek would know that Eleanor Winters had left with a stranger rather than submit to her punishment. She should have felt shame. That's what her uncle had taught her, that a woman's virtue was her most precious possession, that even the appearance of impropriety was a sin. Instead, with each hoofbeat that carried her away from the post, with each breath of air that didn't taste of dust and humiliation, Eleanor felt something unfamiliar unfurling in her chest. Freedom. Martha Coleman's small house sat at the edge of town, separated from its nearest neighbor by a quarter-mile of scrubby desert. Unlike the austere, whitewashed buildings of Redemption Creek proper, Martha's home was a riot of color. The adobe walls were painted a soft blue, the door a vibrant red. Wind chimes made of copper and glass hung from the porch, catching the light and sending it dancing across the ground. Gabriel reined in his horse at the gate to the small yard, where improbably lush plants grew despite the harsh climate. Eleanor felt his surprise and the slight tension of his body behind her. "Your aunt has a green thumb," he remarked. "She knows which plants can survive the desert," Eleanor replied, "and how to help them thrive." Before they could dismount, the red door swung open and Martha Coleman stepped onto the porch. At 65, she was still straight-backed and strong, her silver hair plaited in a single thick braid that hung down her back. Her dress was simple but brightly colored, and her weathered face broke into a smile when she saw Eleanor. The smile faltered when she noticed Eleanor's disheveled state and the stranger behind her. "Eleanor, what's happened?" Martha hurried down the steps, her keen eyes taking in her niece's sunburned face and dirty dress. "Uncle had me tied to the post," Eleanor explained as Gabriel helped her down from the horse, "for refusing Raymond Blackwood." Martha's expression darkened. 3 hours he had planned, in this heat. He'd have killed you. She turned her sharp gaze to Gabriel. "And you are?" "Gabriel Montana," he replied, tipping his hat. "I was passing through." Martha's eyes narrowed slightly, assessing him with the same careful attention she gave to wild-crafted herbs. "Well, Mr. Montana, it seems my niece owes you a debt." "No debt," he said, shaking his head. "Just did what any decent man would do." Martha made a sound that suggested her opinion of decent men was less than favorable. "Come inside, both of you. Eleanor needs water and something for that sunburn." The interior of Martha's house was as colorful as the outside. Bundles of herbs hung from the ceiling beams, filling the air with a pleasant, medicinal scent. The space reminded Eleanor of foggy memories from her childhood. Evenings spent watching her aunt work while her mother helped, the two sisters speaking in hushed tones about plants and remedies. Those visits had stopped abruptly after her uncle deemed Martha's practices ungodly, but the familiar sense now stirred deeper memories. Her mother carefully labeling specimens in her journal, consulting Martha about their properties, the bond between the sisters evident in their shared passion. "Your mother was the true botanist," Martha said softly as if reading Eleanor's thoughts. "I just learned enough to be useful." Elizabeth could identify plants no one else had documented in the territory. "That's one reason your father admired her so. Her mind was as beautiful to him as her face." Shelves lined the walls, filled with glass jars of various sizes, each meticulously labeled in Martha's precise handwriting. A large wooden table dominated the main room, its surface covered with mortar and pestle, scales, and other equipment for Martha's work. Martha guided Eleanor to a chair and immediately set about pouring cool water from a clay pitcher. "Drink slowly," she instructed, handing Eleanor the cup. "Too much at once will make you sick." While Eleanor sipped the water, Martha dampened a cloth and began gently cleaning the dirt from her niece's face. "That man," she muttered, examining the bruise on Eleanor's cheek, "using the Bible to justify his cruelty." Gabriel remained standing near the door, his tall frame seeming too large for the small house. His eyes took in the room, lingering on the herbs and medical equipment. "You're a healer," he said to Martha. It wasn't a question. Martha glanced at him, her hands still busy tending to Eleanor. "Some call me that. Others have less flattering names." "The church calls her a witch," Eleanor said quietly, "because she uses plants instead of prayer." "I use both," Martha corrected, "but your uncle prefers that people rely solely on his interpretation of God's will." She set aside the cloth and reached for a jar of greenish salve. "This will help with the burn," she explained, gently applying it to Eleanor's reddened skin. The cool salve was immediately soothing, and Eleanor closed her eyes in relief. "Thank you, Aunt Martha." "Now," Martha said, seating herself across from Eleanor, "tell me about this business with Blackwood. Abraham has been trying to marry you off to that old lecher for months, but what brought on today's demonstration?" Eleanor's hands tightened around the water cup. "The wedding was set for next week. I told Uncle I wouldn't go through with it. He—" She hesitated, glancing at Gabriel, unsure how much to reveal in front of this stranger. Martha followed her gaze. "Mr. Montana, would you mind tending to your horse? There's water in the trough outside." Gabriel nodded, understanding the request for privacy. "I'll see to him," he said, and stepped outside, closing the door behind him. Once he was gone, Eleanor's composure cracked. Uncle was furious. He said I had no choice, that as my guardian, he could marry me to whomever he chose. When I still refused, he struck me. She touched her bruised cheek. Then he dragged me to the post, said public shame would teach me obedience. Martha's normally kind eyes hardened with anger. "Abraham has gone too far this time. But why now, Eleanor? You've bent to his will for years. What changed?" Eleanor stared down at her hands. "Last night I found Blackwood in my room." Martha drew in a sharp breath. "He didn't do anything," Eleanor clarified quickly, "but he said he was previewing his property. Said once we were married I would learn to welcome his attention." She shuddered at the memory of his cold eyes, the proprietary way his gaze had traveled over her body. "I'd rather die than be his wife." Martha reached across the table and took Eleanor's hands in her own. "You won't have to, my dear. Not if I have anything to say about it." "But Uncle has legal authority over me," Eleanor said, the hopelessness of her situation settling over her again. "And Blackwood is the richest man in town. They won't stop until they get what they want." A calculating look crossed Martha's face. "Perhaps, but this Gabriel Montana, he said he has a deed to your father's northern property?" Eleanor nodded, confused by the change of subject. "He showed Uncle a document. I didn't know Father sold any land before he died." "He didn't tell many people," Martha said carefully. "Your father was cautious in his last months." Eleanor's confusion deepened. "What do you mean? Father was devoted to the church, to Uncle's church. Why would he sell land without telling him?" Martha was silent for a long moment, as though weighing what to say next. Finally she sighed. "Your father and Abraham were not as aligned as you've been led to believe. Thomas had concerns about the direction Abraham was taking with the congregation." Well, this was news to Eleanor. She had been 12 when her parents died in the influenza epidemic that swept through the territory. In the decades since, her uncle had painted a portrait of her father as his most devoted follower, a man who shared his strict interpretation of Scripture and unyielding approach to sin. "What kind of concerns?" Eleanor asked. "That's a longer conversation than we have time for now, but you should know that your father was a different man than the one Abraham describes. He was kind, thoughtful, and he had connections beyond this small town that Abraham never knew about." Eleanor tilted her head questioningly. "Connections? What kind of connections?" Martha glanced toward the door, ensuring they were still alone. "Your father maintained correspondence with several influential men in the territory. Judge Samuel Parker, for one, a territorial judge with considerable power. They attended law school together before your father chose the ministry instead." "A judge?" Eleanor tried to recall if she'd ever heard the name. Uncle never mentioned any such friendship. "Of course not," Martha replied with a knowing smile. "Abraham wouldn't want you to know there were people outside his influence who cared about your family. Samuel was a frequent visitor when you were small. He even stood as your godfather at your baptism, though Abraham has likely scrubbed that detail from church records." The revelation stunned Eleanor. Another piece of her past, another connection, deliberately hidden from her. "The judge still asks after you in his letters," Martha continued. "He's a good man, honest, fair-minded, the kind of ally we might need someday." The mention of her mother's name brought a familiar ache to Eleanor's chest. Elizabeth Winters had been a gentle, educated woman who had taught Eleanor to read and write before most girls in the territory learned their letters. The memories Eleanor had of her were precious but fading: the scent of lavender, the sound of her voice reading stories at bedtime. "I have something for you," Martha said, interrupting Eleanor's thoughts. She rose and went to a small trunk in the corner of the room. After rummaging for a moment, she returned with a leather-bound book. "Your mother's journal. I've kept it safe, waiting for the right time." Eleanor took the book with trembling hands. The leather was soft with age, the pages yellowed at the edges. Opening it, she recognized her mother's elegant handwriting immediately. The first entry was dated 20 years earlier, when Elizabeth had first arrived in the Arizona territory as a young bride. "She was a botanist," Martha explained, watching Eleanor's plum. "Self-taught but knowledgeable. She documented the desert plants, their properties, their uses. Your father encouraged her work, even when others thought it improper for a woman to pursue such interests." Eleanor traced her fingers over a detailed sketch of a desert flower, the careful notes beside it describing its medicinal properties. A side of her mother she had never known existed in these pages, a woman of intelligence and passion, not just the meek preacher's wife her uncle had described. "Why didn't you give this to me before?" she asked, looking up at her aunt. Martha's expression was sad. "Abraham forbade me from seeing you after your parents died, said my influence would corrupt you. This is the first time you have been in my home in 10 years, Eleanor." The realization hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She had memories of visiting her aunt as a child, of helping her gather herbs and watching her work. But after her parents' deaths, her uncle had cut off that connection, telling her that Martha's practices were ungodly, dangerous. "He lied to me," Eleanor whispered, the foundation of her world cracking beneath her. "About everything." Martha's hand covered hers. "Your uncle believes his own lies, which makes them all the more convincing. But now you have a choice, Eleanor. You can go back to him, submit to his authority, or you can choose a different path." Eleanor's fingers tightened around the journal. "What path? Where would I go?" Before Martha could answer, a knock sounded at the door. Gabriel's voice came through the wood. "Miss Coleman, we may have a problem." Martha rose and opened the door. Gabriel stood on the porch, his expression grim. "Riders coming this way," he said. "5 men, including the preacher and Blackwood. They don't look like they're coming for a social call." Eleanor felt fear surge through her again, but Martha remained calm. "Mr. Montana, would you be so kind as to help Eleanor to the back room? I'll handle my brother-in-law." Gabriel looked uncertain. "They might not be inclined to listen to reason, ma'am." A smile that could only be described as wolfish crossed Martha's face. "I'm counting on it." She reached into a cabinet and withdrew a shotgun that looked well used and well maintained. "This tends to make men more reasonable." Gabriel's eyebrows rose, but he didn't comment on the weapon. Instead, he moved to Eleanor's side, helping her to her feet. "Come on," he said quietly. "Your aunt seems capable of handling herself, but let's get you out of sight." He guided her through a curtained doorway into a small bedroom at the back of the house. The room was simply furnished: a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, a small table with a wash basin. The window was open, letting in what little breeze stirred in the hot afternoon. "Stay away from the window," Gabriel advised, positioning himself to see through a gap in the curtain back to the main room. "I want to hear what they have to say, but I don't want them to see you." Eleanor clutched her mother's journal to her chest, her heart pounding. Through the thin walls of the house, she could hear the approach of horses, the sounds of men dismounting, boots on the wooden steps of the porch. Then her uncle's voice, sharp with authority. "Martha, open this door immediately." The sound of the front door opening, Martha's cool response. "Lower your voice, Abraham. You're not in your pulpit now." "Where is she?" Pierce demanded. "Where is my niece?" "Not here," Martha replied, the lie smooth and convincing. "Don't play games with me, woman. We saw that drifter's horse outside. Eleanor was seen leaving town with him." "Mr. Montana stopped to water his horse," Martha said. "He's continued on his way. As for Eleanor, if she's run away from you, I can't say I blame her. Tying a girl to a post in this heat? You might as well have put a gun to her head." "That girl needs discipline." Blackwood's voice now, oily and self-righteous. "As her future husband, I have a vested interest in her moral development." "A future husband?" Martha's laugh was cold. "Raymond, the only woman desperate enough to marry you would be blind, deaf, and lacking any sense of smell." Eleanor heard Blackwood sputter with indignation, and despite her fear, a small smile tugged at her lips. Her aunt had always had a sharp tongue. "Enough of this," Pierce snapped. "Martha, we know she's here. Stand aside or I'll have the sheriff remove you." "You mean that puppet Jenkins?" Martha's voice remained steady, but Eleanor could hear the steel beneath it. "He has no authority on my property without a warrant. And unless you want to explain to a judge why you were torturing your niece in the town square, I suggest you leave now." The tension was palpable, even through the walls. Eleanor found herself holding her breath, waiting for the explosion of violence that seemed inevitable. Instead, she heard the sound of a shotgun being cocked. "I'm an old woman who lives alone, Abraham," Martha said, her voice dangerously soft. "I've grown accustomed to protecting myself. Now, all of you get off my property before I decide my doorstep needs redecorating." A tense silence followed. Then Pierce's voice, tight with controlled rage. "This isn't over, Martha. The girl is my legal ward. The law is on my side." "The law doesn't permit abuse," Martha replied. "Come back with a warrant if you're so confident in your position." More silence, then the sounds of reluctant retreat, boots on the steps, men mounting horses. "You'll regret this, Martha," Blackwood called as they departed. "Everyone who stands against us regrets it eventually." The threat hung in the air even after the sound of hoofbeats faded. Eleanor released her breath, her legs suddenly weak with relief. Gabriel turned from the curtain, his expression thoughtful. "Your aunt is a formidable woman," he observed. "She always was," Eleanor replied, a new appreciation for Martha forming in her mind. "I just never knew how much." Martha appeared in the doorway, the shotgun still in her hands. "They're gone for now," she said, "but they'll be back. Abraham won't let this challenge to his authority stand, and Blackwood—" She shook her head. "That man wants what he wants, and he's used to getting it." "Why does he want me so badly?" Eleanor asked. "There are younger women in town, prettier ones who wouldn't fight him." A shadow crossed Martha's face. "It's not you he wants, dear. It's what you represent." She glanced at Gabriel, then back to Eleanor. "We need to talk, all of us. But first, you should rest. You've had a trying day, and night will be here soon enough." Eleanor wanted to protest, to demand answers immediately, but the events of the day were catching up with her. Exhaustion pulled at her limbs, and her head throbbed from sun exposure. "A short rest," she conceded. "But then I want the truth, all of it." Martha nodded. "All of it," she promised. "Though you may wish I'd kept some of it to myself when you hear it." With that cryptic statement, she left the room, gesturing for Gabriel to follow. The last thing Eleanor saw before exhaustion claimed her was Gabriel's thoughtful gaze lingering on her face, as though he were trying to solve a puzzle. Eleanor woke to the soft, golden light of sunset filtering through the window. For a disorienting moment, she didn't know where she was. The bed beneath her was unfamiliar, the room strange. Then memory rushed back. The post, Gabriel's intervention, her aunt's house. She sat up slowly, her body aching from the day's ordeal. Her mother's journal lay beside her on the bed, and she touched it gently, still hardly believing it was real. A tangible connection to the woman she had lost too young. The sound of low voices came from the main room, Martha and Gabriel, deep in conversation. Eleanor rose, straightened her rumpled dress as best she could, and moved to the doorway. They sat at the table, a map spread between them, their heads bent close as they examined it. Gabriel looked up as she entered, and something in his expression made her pause. It was not just concern she saw there, but a deep, simmering anger carefully controlled. "How are you feeling?" Martha asked, her eyes assessing Eleanor's condition. "Better," Eleanor answered, though her skin still felt tight and hot from the sun. "What are you looking at?" Martha and Gabriel exchanged a glance that spoke volumes. "Come sit," Martha said, gesturing to an empty chair. "It's time for that truth I promised you." Eleanor took the seat, her eyes falling on the map. She recognized it immediately. A detailed survey of her father's property, including the northern section that Gabriel claimed to have purchased. "This is about the land," she said, looking between them. "Why is it so important? It's mostly desert, isn't it?" "Not just desert," Gabriel replied, his finger tapping a spot on the map marked with a small X. "Your father found silver there, about 6 months before he died." Eleanor stared at him in shock. "Silver? That's impossible. If there was silver on our land, I would have known." "Would you?" Martha's voice was gentle but pointed. "Abraham has controlled every aspect of your life since you were 12 years old. Do you really think he would have shared information that might give you independence?" The question struck Eleanor like a physical blow. How much had been kept from her over the years? How many truths had been buried beneath her uncle's strict control? "Your father was cautious," Gabriel continued. "He didn't announce his discovery. He wanted to verify the extent of the deposit, make sure it was substantial before he told anyone." "Anyone except you," Eleanor said, studying Gabriel's face. "Why would he tell a stranger about silver on his land?" Gabriel's expression remained steady under her scrutiny. "I wasn't a stranger to your father. I knew Thomas Winters for years. I was in Montana when I received his letter about the silver. He wanted a partner he could trust, someone with experience in mining who wouldn't rob him blind." "And that was you, a drifter?" A faint smile touched Gabriel's lips. "I wasn't always a drifter, Miss Winters. I spent 5 years working silver mines in Nevada. Before that, I was a cavalry officer." Eleanor absorbed this new information, trying to reconcile the man before her with the image of a soldier, a miner. "If father trusted you, why did he sell you the land instead of partnering with you?" Gabriel's expression darkened. "Because he didn't trust his brother-in-law. He knew Abraham had designs on the property, suspected he might try to claim it for the church after Thomas was gone. The sale was a legal safeguard, a way to ensure the land would be developed as Thomas wanted, with a portion of the proceeds going to you and your mother." Eleanor turned to Martha. "Did you know about this?" Martha nodded slowly. "Not all of it. I knew Thomas was concerned about Abraham's influence over the congregation, his constant demands for money to build a bigger church. I knew he wanted to secure your future." She hesitated, then added, "What I didn't know until today was that Abraham may have had a more direct role in your parents' deaths than simple neglect." Martha's eyes grew distant, as though seeing into the past. "Abraham wasn't always this way. When they were young, he and Thomas were inseparable, two brothers with the same dream. But Abraham always lived in Thomas's shadow. Thomas had the charisma, the natural leadership, while Abraham had only his fierce devotion to Scripture." She sighed heavily. "When your mother came with her education and inheritance, something broke in Abraham. He began to see Thomas's happiness as a personal slight from God. His faith twisted into something darker, a belief that he was being tested, that he deserved what Thomas had. Eleanor tried to reconcile this more complex image with the tyrannical uncle she knew. Do you think he ever loved any of us, even in his way? Martha considered this carefully. I believe he loved the idea of being your savior, the righteous guardian who would shape you into his vision of godliness. That's the most dangerous kind of love, Eleanor. The kind that needs to possess and control rather than nurture and release. A chill ran through Eleanor despite the warm evening. What do you mean? Martha's eyes were sad but resolute. The influenza that killed your parents came through town during a harsh winter. Thomas sent for medicine from Phoenix, paid for it himself. Abraham that was supposed to ride it out to meet the courier and bring it back. He didn't? He delayed, Martha said, her voice hard with old anger. Said the weather was too dangerous, the roads too treacherous. By the time he finally went 3 days later, your mother was already gone. Your father followed the next day. Eleanor felt as though the floor were tilting beneath her. Are you saying Uncle let them die? Deliberately? I'm saying he didn't try very hard to save them, Martha replied carefully, and within a week of their passing, he had moved into your father's house and taken control of the church. Within a month, he was claiming the northern property belonged to the church, that Thomas had promised it in a verbal agreement, which is why your father's written agreement with me was so important, Gabriel added. It established legal ownership that Abraham couldn't contest, at least not without exposing his own lies. Eleanor's mind was spinning trying to process these revelations. The uncle who had raised her, who had claimed to be protecting her with his strict rules and harsh punishments, had he been capable of letting her parents die, of trying to steal her inheritance? And Blackwood? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Where does he fit into this? Raymond has money, but his fortune is dwindling, Martha explained. He's made poor investments, and his mines in Colorado aren't producing like they used to. He needs a new source of income. And a young wife, Gabriel added, his distaste evident, preferably one with a claim to valuable property. Eleanor looked down at the map, at the small X that marked the silver deposit. The reason for Blackwood's persistent pursuit suddenly became clear. It wasn't her youth or beauty he wanted. It was the chance to control the silver mine through marriage. It wasn't always this way, Martha added, her voice softening with an old sadness. Abraham and Thomas were close once in their youth. They came west together, two brothers with the same dream of building something meaningful. But where Thomas saw the church as a way to serve others, Abraham gradually came to see it as a means to power. She stared into the fire, remembering. After your mother inherited money from her parents, I saw the change in him. The envy, the resentment that Thomas had both a successful ministry and a wealthy, educated wife. Blackwood recognized that weakness in him, that hunger for status and control, and exploited it. They've fed each other's worst instincts for years. Eleanor tried to reconcile this more complex picture with the tyrannical uncle she knew. Do you think he ever loved any of us, even in his way? Martha considered this carefully. I believe he loved the idea of being your savior, the righteous guardian who would shape you into his vision of godliness. That's the most dangerous kind of love, Eleanor. The kind that needs to possess and control rather than nurture and release. If you knew about the silver, she said to Gabriel, why wait until now to come claim the land? It's been 10 years since my parents died. A shadow crossed Gabriel's face. I was indisposed for some years. When I finally received your father's letter about his death, I came as quickly as I could. There was more to that story, Eleanor sensed, but now wasn't the time to press for details. So what happens now? She asked. You have the deed, but Uncle won't give up easily. Neither will Blackwood. No, they won't, Martha agreed grimly, which is why you can't stay here. They'll be back, with the sheriff this time, and a warrant Abraham will have no trouble obtaining from Judge Wilson, who conveniently owes a large debt to Raymond Blackwood. Then where? Eleanor asked, the enormity of her situation settling over her. She had nowhere to go, no money of her own, no skills that would help her survive beyond Redemption Creek. The property, Gabriel said, tapping the map. There's a cabin there built by an old prospector years ago. It's remote, defensible. They'd have to cross my land to reach you, which would give us legal grounds to keep them at bay. Martha nodded slowly. It might work, at least until we can establish Eleanor's legal independence. And how do we do that? Eleanor asked. I'm unmarried, underage according to territorial law. Uncle is my legal guardian until I'm 25 or wed. Martha and Gabriel exchanged another of those meaningful glances. There are ways, Martha said vaguely. But first we need to get you somewhere safe. You'll leave tonight under cover of darkness. Both of you, Gabriel added, looking at Martha. Pierce won't forget your role in this. You won't be safe here either. Martha hesitated, looking around at her home, the herbs hanging from the rafters, the shelves of medicines and tinctures. This is my home, she said softly. Everything I've built is here. And it will still be here when this is resolved, Gabriel assured her. But right now, Eleanor needs you. And I need someone who knows the land, the plants. Someone who can help establish a presence on the property while I deal with the legal matters in town. Martha considered his words, then nodded reluctantly. You're right. Besides, she added with a grim smile, I've been wanting to show Abraham that his control only extends so far. This seems like the perfect opportunity. Eleanor looked between them, these two people who were risking everything to help her. One a relative she barely knew, the other a stranger with ties to her father she hadn't known existed. Thank you, she said simply, the words inadequate for the depth of her gratitude. Gabriel nodded, his expression softening slightly. Your father was a good man, Miss Winters. He helped me once, when I was at my lowest. I'm just returning the favor. Call me Eleanor, she said impulsively. If we're going to be hiding out together on my father's land, I think we can dispense with formalities. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Eleanor, then, and you should call me Gabe. Most people do. Well, now that we're all properly introduced, Martha cut in dryly, we should prepare to leave. Night will be here soon, and we have much to do before then. As they began gathering supplies, food, water, medicines, and the few personal items Martha insisted on bringing, Eleanor felt a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration. For the first time in her memory, she was taking action, making choices that would shape her own destiny. Her gaze fell on her mother's journal, still lying on the bed where she'd left it. She picked it up, holding it close to her chest. Whatever came next, she would face it with this tangible connection to her past, and with the newfound strength she was discovering within herself. The desert didn't kill those who were strong, her mother had written. It revealed their strength. Eleanor hoped she was strong enough for what lay ahead. Night descended over the desert like a heavy blanket, bringing with it a profound silence broken only by the occasional cry of a hunting coyote. The temperature dropped rapidly once the sun disappeared, the scorching heat of day giving way to an almost uncomfortable chill. Eleanor shivered as she helped Martha pack the last of their essential supplies onto Gabriel's horse, and the old mule Martha kept for trips to gather herbs in the desert. Her aunt had insisted on bringing her medicines and tools, saying they might be their most valuable assets in the days ahead. Desert nights get cold, Gabriel observed, draping a worn leather coat over Eleanor's shoulders. The unexpected gesture caught her off guard, and she looked up to find his eyes on her face, assessing. The coat's seen better days, but it'll keep you warm. The leather was soft from years of wear, and it carried his scent. Horses, tobacco, and something distinctly masculine that Eleanor couldn't name. She pulled it closer around herself, grateful for both the warmth and the kindness. Thank you, she said simply. Gabriel nodded, then turned to secure the last of their provisions. We should move. Your uncle may decide to come back with reinforcements once night falls. Martha emerged from the house carrying a final bundle. She had changed from her colorful dress into practical riding clothes, trousers and a man's shirt beneath a heavy shawl. Seeing Eleanor's surprised look, she smiled wryly. Did you think I rode side saddle into the desert to gather plants? A woman my age has earned the right to be comfortable. Despite the gravity of their situation, Eleanor felt a smile tug at her lips. In the short time since their reunion, her aunt had systematically demolished every assumption Eleanor had about proper feminine behavior, assumptions carefully cultivated by her uncle over the past decade. Are you ready? Gabriel asked, his voice low. Once we leave, there's no turning back. Pierce and Blackwood will view this as open defiance. It's been open defiance since you cut her from that post, Martha pointed out. We passed the point of no return hours ago. Gabriel conceded with a nod, then turned to Eleanor. And you? Are you certain this is what you want? The question gave her pause. Was she certain? leaving meant abandoning everything she had ever known, everything that had defined her life until now. It meant being branded a rebel, possibly worse. It meant the protection of the church, however stifling, would be withdrawn completely. But staying meant marriage to Blackwood. It meant a lifetime of submission to a man who viewed her as property, who had already made his intentions clear in the most disturbing way. It meant never discovering the truth about her parents, about the legacy they had left her. "I'm certain," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Gabriel studied her face for a moment longer, then nodded, apparently satisfied with what he saw there. "Let's go." They set out under a star-filled sky, avoiding the main road and instead following game trails that wound through the scrubby vegetation. Gabriel led the way, his familiarity with the terrain suggesting he had studied maps of the area thoroughly before arriving in Redemption Creek. Martha followed on the mule, with Eleanor riding behind Gabriel on his stallion. Eleanor found herself acutely aware of his solid presence before her, the breadth of his shoulders, the way he moved in perfect harmony with his horse. Being this close to a man who wasn't family was entirely new, and despite the dire circumstances, she found herself distracted by the unfamiliar sensations. They rode in silence for the first hour, the only sounds the soft thud of hooves on packed earth and the occasional jingle of tack. The moon rose, casting long shadows across the desert floor and illuminating the strange twisted shapes of cacti and desert trees. "We'll cut north here," Gabriel said eventually, gesturing toward a narrow pass between two rocky outcroppings. "It's rougher terrain, but less likely to be patrolled." "Patrolled?" Eleanor echoed. "You think they're searching for us already?" "Your uncle strikes me as a man who doesn't take challenges to his authority lightly," Gabriel replied, "and Blackwood has too much at stake to let you slip away easily." Martha made a soft sound of agreement. "Abraham has always believed God ordained him to rule over others. Being defied by a woman, two women, will have wounded his pride beyond bearing." Eleanor considered this. She had lived with her uncle for 10 years, witnessed his strict enforcement of church discipline, his unyielding stance on sin and redemption. But until today, she had never truly been the target of his wrath. She had been obedient, malleable, the perfect example of a godly young woman under his guidance. "He'll come after us," she said, certainty settling cold in her stomach. "He won't stop until he has me back under his control." "Then he'll be disappointed," Gabriel said, his voice hardening. "Your father entrusted me with more than just land, Eleanor. He asked me to look out for you if anything happened to him. I intend to honor that promise." Before Eleanor could respond to this new revelation, Martha raised her hand sharply. "Wait, listen." They reined in their mounts, falling silent. At first, Eleanor heard nothing but the soft breathing of the horses and the rustle of wind through desert scrub. Then it came, the distant but unmistakable sound of multiple riders approaching from the south. "Damn," Gabriel muttered. He scanned their surroundings quickly, then pointed to a cluster of large boulders about 50 yards off the trail. "There, we can take cover behind those rocks." They urged their mounts forward, reaching the shelter of the boulders just as the sounds of pursuit grew louder. Gabriel helped Eleanor and Martha dismount, then led the animals deeper into the shadows, where they wouldn't be easily spotted. "Stay low," he instructed, drawing his pistol. "If it's Pierce and his men, I don't want to fight unless we have to. But be ready." Eleanor's heart hammered in her chest as she crouched beside her aunt behind a large rock. Martha's expression was calm, but Eleanor could see her hand resting on the small revolver she had tucked into her belt before they left. Another surprise from this woman who was so different from what Eleanor had been led to believe. The riders came into view, moonlight glinting off gun barrels and the occasional flash of a deputy's badge. Eleanor counted 6 men, including Sheriff Jenkins, her uncle, and Blackwood. They moved slowly, scanning the terrain as they went, clearly searching for signs of their passage. "Spread out," Jenkins called. "Check for tracks. They can't have gotten far." The men dispersed slightly, their horses picking their way carefully across the rocky ground. One rider, a young deputy Eleanor recognized as Billy Harding, came dangerously close to their hiding place. Gabriel tensed beside her, his finger moving to the trigger of his pistol. Eleanor held her breath, silently praying the deputy wouldn't venture any closer. As if in answer to her prayers, Blackwood's voice cut through the night. "This is pointless, Jenkins. It's too dark to track effectively. We're wasting time." "What do you suggest?" Jenkins asked, clearly deferring to Blackwood despite his official authority. "They're heading for the northern property," Blackwood said with certainty. "The Montana fellow claims to own it, and it's the only place they feel safe. I say we ride straight there and wait for them to arrive." Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. Blackwood had guessed their destination easily enough. If he and the others reached the cabin first, they would be walking into a trap. Her uncle's voice joined the conversation. "Raymond is right. My niece has nowhere else to go. Martha would have told her about the cabin by now." The bitterness in his tone when he mentioned Martha made Eleanor wince. "We can cut through Miller's Pass and be there well before them, especially if they're trying to avoid the main trails." There was a murmur of agreement among the men. Jenkins whistled sharply, calling the deputies back to the group. "All right then, Miller's Pass it is. Let's ride." The search party turned their horses and rode off at a brisk pace, heading northeast. Eleanor waited until the sound of hoofbeats had faded completely before releasing the breath she'd been holding. "That was close," she whispered. "Too close," Gabriel agreed, holstering his pistol. "And now they're heading straight for the cabin." "Can we reach it before them?" Eleanor asked. "If they take Miller's Pass—" "We can't," Gabriel cut her off. "Miller's Pass is the fastest route by far. They'll be waiting for us if we go there now." Martha frowned thoughtfully. "Is there anywhere else we can go? Somewhere to wait until they give up and return to town?" Gabriel considered for a moment, then nodded slowly. "There's an old line shack about 3 miles west of the cabin. It's well hidden in a small canyon. Thomas showed it to me years ago, said he used it when he wanted to get away from the church for a while." Eleanor blinked in surprise. Her father had kept a secret retreat? Another piece of the man she had thought she knew shifted in her mind. "Will it be safe?" "Safer than riding into an ambush," Gabriel replied grimly. "We'll lay low until daylight, then scout the situation at the cabin. With luck, they'll assume we took a different route entirely and move on to search elsewhere." Martha nodded her approval of the plan. "Lead on then. The sooner we're under shelter, the better I'll feel." They mounted up again, Gabriel adjusting their course to head northwest. Eleanor found her thoughts churning as they rode. The father she remembered had been devoted to the church, committed to his role as spiritual leader of Redemption Creek. Yet according to Gabriel and Martha, he had secretly purchased a cabin to escape that very church, had discovered silver and kept it hidden from his brother-in-law, had even made arrangements to protect Eleanor's inheritance behind her uncle's back. Who had Thomas Winters really been? And how much of what she believed about her own past was actually true? The line shack was little more than a one-room structure built of rough logs and stone, tucked into the side of a small box canyon where it was virtually invisible until you were right upon it. Years of disuse had left it dusty and somewhat dilapidated, but the roof was intact and the walls solid enough to provide shelter from the elements. Gabriel led them on a circuitous route to reach it, backtracking and crossing rocky ground where they would leave minimal tracks. By the time they arrived, the moon was high overhead, casting enough light to see by as they unloaded their supplies. "It's not much," Gabriel said as he pushed open the creaking door, "but it'll keep us hidden for now." Eleanor stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the deeper darkness. The interior was sparse: a small iron stove, a rough wooden table with a single chair, a narrow cot against one wall, and shelves holding a few rusted cans and dusty bottles. "My father came here?" she asked, trying to reconcile the austere little cabin with the dignified preacher she remembered. "More often than you might think," Gabriel replied, setting down their supplies. This was where he could be himself, away from the expectations of the congregation. "And who was that?" Eleanor asked softly. "Who was he really?" Gabriel paused in his work, meeting her gaze with unexpected gentleness. He was a good man, caught between what he believed and what his brother-in-law demanded he believe. The church was important to him, but not the way Abraham interpreted it. Thomas saw faith as a source of comfort and community, not a weapon to control others. Martha entered behind them, carrying her medical supplies. "Your father loved God, Eleanor, but he loved people more. That was where he and Abraham differed most fundamentally." She set her bundles on the table and glanced around the cabin. "I came here with him once or twice, when he needed to talk. Elizabeth knew about it too, though Abraham never did." Eleanor tried to absorb this new information, this new image of her father. A man with doubts, with a private retreat, with secrets kept from his brother-in-law but shared with his wife and sister-in-law. It was as though she were meeting him for the first time, a decade after his death. "I wish I had known him better," she said finally. "You were young when he died," Martha reminded her gently, "and Abraham has worked hard to shape your memories in the years since." She reached out and touched Eleanor's cheek. "But you are more like your father than you know. The same quiet strength, the same questioning mind beneath the obedient exterior." Gabriel cleared his throat, breaking the moment. "We should rest while we can. I'll take first watch in case they somehow tracked us here." "I'll take the second," Martha said firmly. "I need less sleep at my age anyway." Gabriel looked like he might argue, then thought better of it. "Wake me in 4 hours then," he conceded. Eleanor felt suddenly exhausted, the events of the day catching up with her all at once. From the shame post to this hidden cabin, she had traveled further from her old life than she could have imagined possible that morning. "You take the cot," Martha told her, seeing her fatigue. "Gabriel and I can make do with blankets on the floor." Eleanor was too tired to argue. She removed Gabriel's coat and laid it aside, then stretched out on the narrow cot, which was surprisingly comfortable compared to the hard-packed earth outside. She expected to lie awake, her mind too full of the day's revelations to allow sleep. Instead, she drifted off almost immediately, her last conscious thought a prayer. Not to her uncle's stern, judgmental God, but to whatever gentler deity might have watched over her father in this quiet place. Eleanor woke to the smell of coffee brewing and the soft murmur of voices. For a moment, she was disoriented, the rough walls of the line shack unfamiliar. Then memory rushed back, the shame post, Gabriel's intervention, their midnight flight from Redemption Creek. She sat up, pushing back her tangled hair. Martha was tending a small fire in the iron stove, while Gabriel stood by the door, cup in hand, speaking in low tones. They both turned at her movement. "Good morning," Martha greeted her. "There's coffee, though it's not as good as what I make at home. We didn't want to risk a larger fire." Eleanor accepted the tin cup Martha offered, savoring the bitter warmth. "What time is it?" "Just past dawn," Gabriel replied. He looked tired but alert, his eyes constantly moving between the door and the small window. "I scouted the area a little while ago. No sign of pursuit, but they're probably still watching the cabin." "What's our plan?" Eleanor asked, surprised at her own practical tone. Yesterday, she had been the dutiful niece, accepting whatever plans others made for her. Today, she found herself thinking like a partner in this escape, not merely a passive participant. Gabriel seemed to notice the shift as well, a flicker of approval crossing his features. "I need to get to the cabin, assess the situation. If Pierce and his men are there, I need to know how many and how well armed." "You can't go alone," Martha objected. "If they catch you, they won't," Gabriel cut her off. "I've spent years moving unseen when I needed to." Something in his tone suggested this skill had been hard-won, perhaps painfully so. "While you're gone, Eleanor and I will prepare," Martha continued, apparently deciding not to press the issue. "We need to inventory our supplies, see how long we can last here if necessary." Eleanor sipped her coffee, considering their situation. "How long do you think Uncle will search for us? He can't leave the church unattended indefinitely." "Abraham is nothing if not stubborn," Martha replied grimly. "And Blackwood has too much at stake to give up easily. They might post a guard at the cabin, return to town themselves." "Then we need a better plan than just hiding," Eleanor said, surprising herself again with her assertiveness. "We need a way to establish my independence legally, so Uncle no longer has control over me or my inheritance." Gabriel and Martha exchanged a look she couldn't quite interpret. "There are options," Gabriel said carefully, "but they all come with complications." "What options?" Eleanor pressed. "Marriage is the most straightforward," Martha answered bluntly. "A husband's authority supersedes a guardian's under territorial law." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm at the implication. Her gaze involuntarily flicked to Gabriel, who was suddenly very interested in the contents of his coffee cup. "That's hardly practical," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I have no prospects, and even if I did, I won't trade one form of control for another." "There are other ways," Gabriel interjected. "Your father's will might help, if we can find it. Or we could petition the territorial court for emancipation, though that's a longer process." And requires evidence of Abraham's unfitness as a guardian, Martha added, which we have, thanks to his public display yesterday, but it would mean a court battle. Judge Parker might help with that, Eleanor suggested, recalling Martha's earlier revelation. If he was father's friend, as you said, Martha nodded approvingly, Samuel would certainly take an interest in your case, especially given his position on the territorial bench and his connection to your family. He's made a career of standing against corruption and overreach of power. I wouldn't be surprised if he'd already heard whispers about Abraham's conduct. Thomas mentioned Parker in his letters, Gabriel confirmed, looking thoughtful. Said he was one of the few men in the territory who couldn't be bought. If we can get this case before him, rather than the local judge who's in Blackwood's pocket, we'd stand a much better chance. I'll need to find a way to contact him, Martha mused. He should know what's happening here. Eleanor felt a small flame of hope ignite. The idea that someone of influence and integrity might stand with them against her uncle's machinations was more comforting than she could express. Eleanor considered these options, none of which seemed particularly promising. For now, we focus on staying free and gathering evidence, she decided. We can't make long-term plans until we know more about our immediate situation. I agree, Martha. Yes, I agree, Martha said. But we should also take steps to secure outside help. While you two prepare for our next move, I could ride to Silver Creek and send a telegraph to Judge Parker. The station there is small enough that it won't draw attention, and Samuel needs to know what's happening. Gabriel looked uncertain. Is it safe for you to go alone? Martha's lips curved in a slight smile. I've been riding these trails alone for 40 years, young man. Besides, they'll be watching for Eleanor, not an old woman on a mule. Eleanor reached for her aunt's hand. Are you sure Judge Parker will help? It's been so many years. Samuel Parker is a man who honors his commitments, Martha said firmly. When he stood as your godfather, he made a vow to protect you should the need arise. And he's never forgotten your father. They rode to each other until Thomas's death. Trust me, once he knows what Abraham has done, wild horses couldn't keep him away. Gabriel nodded his agreement. It's worth the risk. Having a territorial judge on our side could change everything. I'll head for the cabin now while the light is still low. I should be back by midday. He set down his cup and checked his pistol, ensuring it was fully loaded. If I'm not back by sunset, don't wait for me. Take the horse and mule and head north, toward the territorial capital. You'll find allies there, people who knew your father. The businesslike way he discussed the possibility of his capture or death sent a chill through Eleanor. This wasn't a game or an adventure, it was deadly serious. These men were hunting them with guns and the false authority of the law. Be careful, she said, meeting his gaze directly. Something softened briefly in Gabriel's expression. Always am, he replied, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. Then he was gone, slipping out the door and into the early morning light like a shadow. Martha watched him go, then turned to Eleanor with a practical air. Well, we have work to do. First, let's see exactly what supplies we have and how long they'll last. They spent the next hour taking inventory. The provisions they had brought from Martha's house would last several days if they were careful. The line shack itself held a few additional resources, some canned goods that were still good, ammunition for Gabriel's rifle, basic tools that might prove useful. As they worked, Martha began to fill in more details about Eleanor's parents, small stories and memories that painted a picture of a marriage built on mutual respect and genuine affection, not the cold, duty-bound relationship her uncle had described. Your mother was brilliant, Martha said, as they sorted through the medical supplies she had insisted on bringing. Self-taught in botany, but she knew more about desert plants than anyone I've ever met. That journal I gave you barely scratches the surface of her knowledge. Uncle always said she was a dutiful wife who knew her place, Eleanor said, the bitterness in her tone surprising even herself. Martha snorted derisively. Elizabeth Winters knew her place was wherever she chose to be. She accompanied your father on his visits to parishioners, helped with their ailments, taught the women of the congregation about the healing properties of plants that grew in their own gardens. She smiled at some distant memory. Abraham hated it, said women should concern themselves with children and housekeeping, not medicine. And father, did he agree? Thomas was proud of Elizabeth's knowledge. He encouraged her studies, brought her books from Phoenix when he could afford them. Martha handed Eleanor a bundle of dried herbs to store. They had their disagreements, like any couple, but they faced them as equals. It was a partnership, not a dictatorship. Eleanor absorbed this, trying to reconcile these new images with her fading childhood memories. She remembered her mother's gentle hands, her father's deep laugh, remembered the way they would sometimes exchange glances across the dinner table, sharing some private joke or thought. After they died, she said slowly, Uncle told me their marriage had been arranged by their parents, that they did their duty to God by honoring the arrangement. He said true Christians didn't marry for something as fleeting as love or passion. Martha's expression hardened. Of course he did. Abraham has spent his entire life denying the importance of human connection, human joy. He calls it sinful because he fears it, fears what he cannot control. She reached out and took Eleanor's hand. Your parents loved each other deeply, Eleanor. Never doubt that. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, quickly blinked them away. Thank you for telling me the truth. It's long overdue, Martha replied. I should have fought harder to remain in your life after they died, should have challenged Abraham's authority over you. You couldn't have won, Eleanor said, understanding now the power dynamics that had been at play. He had legal custody, the church's support, the town's respect. Perhaps, Martha conceded, but I still should have tried. Instead, I retreated to my house at the edge of town, focused on my medicines and my solitude. A shadow of regret crossed her face. I've had 10 years to regret that choice. Eleanor squeezed her aunt's hand. You're here now. That's what matters. They continued working in companionable silence for a while until Martha spoke again. What do you make of our Mr. Montana? The unexpected question caught Eleanor off guard. I'm not sure what you mean. Martha's knowing look suggested she wasn't fooled by Eleanor's attempted evasion. He's not what I expected from Thomas's description. More intense, carrying more weight on his shoulders. What did Father tell you about him? Eleanor asked, curious about the history between the two men. Not much, just that they had met years ago when Gabriel was in a bad way. Thomas helped him, somehow, and they stayed in touch. Martha arranged her medicines with methodical precision. Thomas trusted him implicitly, which says a great deal about his character. Your father was an excellent judge of people. Eleanor thought about the man who had cut her free from the shame post without hesitation, who had faced down her uncle in Blackwood, who was risking his life even now to secure their safety. He seems honorable, she said carefully, and determined. And handsome, Martha added with a sly glance. If one appreciates that rugged type. Eleanor felt her cheeks warm again. Aunt Martha? Martha chuckled, the sound lightening the mood of the small cabin. I may be old, Eleanor, but I'm not blind. And neither are you, from what I've observed. Before Eleanor could formulate a response that wouldn't further incriminate her, a sound outside the cabin froze them both. Footsteps approaching quickly. Martha moved with surprising speed, grabbing her revolver and positioning herself between Eleanor and the door. Stay back, she whispered. Eleanor's heart hammered in her chest as the footsteps grew closer. Then Gabriel's voice came through the door. It's me. Open up. Martha lowered her gun with visible relief and unbarred the door. Gabriel slipped inside, his expression grim. What happened? Eleanor asked, noting the tension in his posture. Are they at the cabin? They were, Gabriel confirmed, accepting the water Martha offered him. Jenkins and 2 deputies. They had the place surrounded, waiting for us to walk into their trap. Eleanor noticed her aunt looked weary, but satisfied. Did you make it to Silver Creek? She asked. Martha nodded, settling herself on a nearby stool. I did. The telegraph operator was reluctant at first, but a gold coin loosened his conscience. I sent a detailed message to Judge Parker explaining our situation, included what we know about the silver mine, Abraham's fraudulent guardianship, and the real will. I emphasized the danger to your safety, knowing Samuel would consider that his primary concern. Do you think he'll respond? Eleanor asked, hope and doubt warring within her. If I know Samuel, Martha replied with a tired smile, he's already on his way. The man may be approaching 70, but he's still as decisive as the day he took the bench, and he takes his duties, both legal and personal, very seriously. Let's hope so, Gabriel said grimly, because our problems just got worse. What do you mean? Eleanor asked. Pierce and Blackwood weren't at the cabin? No sign of them. My guess is they returned to town after setting up the ambush, left Jenkins to do the dirty work. He took a long drink of water. But that's not our biggest problem. Eleanor felt a knot of dread form in her stomach. What is? Gabriel's eyes met hers directly. They're planning to burn Martha's house to the ground tonight, calling it a cleansing of witchcraft and ungodly influence. Pierce is whipping the congregation into a frenzy, saying Martha corrupted you, turned you against the church. Gabriel hesitated, then added, I overheard something else. Pierce and Blackwood aren't just allies of convenience. They're bound by something deeper. Years ago, Blackwood paid off a significant debt Pierce owed to some dangerous men from Phoenix. In exchange, Pierce has been feeding him information about potential investments in the territory, including the silver on your father's land. It seems your father suspected this arrangement but couldn't prove it. Martha nodded grimly. That explains much. Abraham was never good with money, always believing God would provide. And Raymond has always known how to exploit weaknesses in others. Together, they're a dangerous combination. Abraham's righteous fury gives moral cover to Raymond's greed, while Raymond's resources extend Abraham's reach beyond the church. Martha paled but remained composed. My house, my work, everything I've built over decades. It gets worse, Gabriel continued reluctantly. They're also spreading word that I kidnapped Eleanor, that I'm a wanted man from Nevada who preys on innocent women. Jenkins has sent telegrams to neighboring towns, calling for my arrest on sight. Eleanor felt sick. Her uncle was twisting the truth, using the church's influence to make them fugitives. They're trying to cut off all our options, she realized aloud. That's not all, Gabriel said, his voice dropping lower. I overheard Jenkins talking with his deputies. Pierce has declared you mentally unstable, Eleanor. Claims your mother's melancholia has manifested in you as religious mania and delusions. If they capture you, they plan to commit you to the territorial asylum in Phoenix. The blood drained from Eleanor's face. She had heard stories about the asylum, the ice baths, the restraints, the treatments that left patients shells of their former selves. Women were committed for everything from reading too much to disagreeing with their husbands. Once inside, they rarely emerged. He can't do that, she whispered, though she knew all too well that he could. A guardian had nearly absolute power over a female ward, especially one declared mentally unfit. He won't get the chance, Gabriel said, his voice hardening with determination. I made your father a promise, and I intend to keep it. Martha had been silent, processing the news about her home. Now she looked up, her eyes sharp with decision. We need to recover the will, she said. Thomas's actual will, not the forgery Abraham probated after their deaths. Gabriel's expression sharpened with interest. You know where it is? In the church, Martha replied, hidden in Thomas's old Bible, the one Abraham keeps locked in the vestry cabinet. Thomas told me about it just before he fell ill, said he'd made provisions for Eleanor that would surprise his brother-in-law. Why didn't you tell me this before? Eleanor asked, stunned by this new revelation. Because retrieving it means going back to Redemption Creek, Martha explained grimly, into the very heart of Abraham's power. I hadn't wanted to suggest something so dangerous unless it became absolutely necessary. She gestured at Gabriel. It just became necessary. Gabriel considered this information, clearly weighing the risks. A will that contradicts the one Pierce filed would change everything, he agreed. It would give us legal standing to challenge his guardianship, protect Eleanor's inheritance. But how do we get it? Eleanor asked. The church will be guarded, especially now. A slow, calculating look crossed Gabriel's face. Not tonight it won't be. Not if the entire town is gathered to watch Martha's house burn. Martha's eyes widened with understanding. A distraction. Gabriel nodded. I'll create a commotion at the other end of town. While Pierce and the others are dealing with that, you two can slip into the church, retrieve the Bible. No, Eleanor said firmly, surprising both of them. I'll go alone. Absolutely not, Gabriel countered immediately. It's too dangerous. I'm the only one who can move freely in the church without raising suspicion, Eleanor argued. If anyone sees me, they'll assume Uncle sent me to fetch something. You two would be recognized instantly. Martha frowned. She has a point, Gabriel. Eleanor knows the church better than either of us, knows where Thomas's Bible would be kept. And if you're caught, Gabriel demanded, his concern evident, Pierce will lock you away and throw away the key. Eleanor lifted her chin. Then I won't get caught. She met his gaze steadily. I spent 10 years learning to be invisible in that church, to move quietly, to avoid drawing attention. Let me use those skills for something that matters. Gabriel studied her face, clearly conflicted. Finally, he sighed. We'll all go, he decided. I'll create the distraction. Martha will keep watch outside the church. Eleanor will retrieve the Bible. No one goes alone. It was a compromise, and Eleanor recognized it as the best she was likely to get. Agreed. Martha nodded her acceptance as well. When do we leave? Gabriel looked out the small window at the position of the sun. We have a few hours before nightfall. We'll need to approach town from the west. Stay hidden until dark. He turned back to them, his expression grave. If anything goes wrong, if we get separated, meet back here. Wait 24 hours. If I don't return by then, take the deed to my property and the will, assuming we find it, and go to the territorial capital. Ask for Judge Samuel Parker. He knew your father, Eleanor. He'll help you. The methodical way he prepared for disaster sent another chill through Eleanor. This plan could easily end with one or all of them captured, injured, and otherwise, yet they had no choice. Her uncle was systematically destroying their options, their reputations, their very freedom. We should rest while we can, Martha suggested, practical as always. Tonight will test us all. As they made final preparations, Eleanor found herself drawn to the small window, looking out at the vast desert landscape. Somewhere out there was the silver mine her father had discovered, the land he had protected for her future. Somewhere out there was a life free from her uncle's control, from Blackwood's possessive gaze, from the suffocating constraints that had defined her existence for so long. Freedom was within reach if they survived the night. They approached Redemption Creek under cover of darkness, leaving their horses tethered in a small grove of mesquite trees a quarter-mile from town. Gabriel led the way, moving with the silent efficiency of a man accustomed to traveling undetected. Eleanor had changed into simpler clothes borrowed from Martha's supplies, a dark skirt and shirtwaist that wouldn't stand out if she was spotted. Her aunt had braided her hair tightly against her head, further altering her appearance. Gabriel had darkened his face with dirt, making his features harder to distinguish in the dim light. They paused at the edge of town, crouching behind an abandoned wagon. In the distance, they could see a crowd gathering near Martha's blue adobe house. Torches illuminated angry faces, and even from this distance, they could hear Pierce's voice rising and falling as he addressed his congregation. The witch has corrupted my niece with her potions and ungodly practices. His voice carried on the night air. Her influence must be purged from our godly community. Murmurs of agreement rose from the crowd. Eleanor saw Martha flinch slightly at the hatred directed toward her home, her life's work. I'm sorry, Eleanor whispered, touching her aunt's arm. Martha's expression was pained but resolute. Things can be replaced, lives cannot. She squeezed Eleanor's hand. Let's ensure your uncle doesn't destroy anything else that matters. Gabriel pointed toward the church, which stood dark and seemingly unattended at the opposite end of the main street. The vestry entrance is on the south side? Eleanor nodded. It's usually unlocked during the day, but Uncle locks it at night. I know where he keeps the key. Good. Here's how we'll do this. Gabriel outlined his plan quickly. I'll create a distraction near the livery stable, enough to draw attention away from Martha's house, but not so much that they abandon it entirely. Martha, you'll position yourself between the church and the crowd. Give a warning if anyone heads your way. Eleanor, you go straight for the Bible, nothing else. We meet back at the mesquite grove in 30 minutes, no longer. The simplicity of the plan was its strength. Fewer moving parts meant fewer opportunities for things to go wrong. Still, Eleanor felt her heart pounding as she contemplated entering the church alone, searching for evidence against the man who had raised her. Ready? Gabriel asked, his eyes moving between them. Martha nodded grimly. As I'll ever be. Yes, Eleanor said, swallowing her fear. She had spent her life being the obedient niece, the perfect example of feminine submission. Tonight she would be something else entirely, a woman fighting for her freedom, her future. Then let's go, And be careful, Gabriel added, his gaze lingering on Eleanor for a moment longer than necessary. Both of you. They separated, each moving toward their assigned positions. Eleanor skirted the edge of town, keeping to shadows, avoiding the pools of light cast by the few street lamps. The church loomed ahead, its white steeple gleaming faintly in the moonlight. She waited in the shadows beside the building, counting the minutes until Gabriel's distraction. Right on time, a series of loud explosions erupted from the direction of the livery stable, followed by the frightened whinnying of horses and shouts of alarm. Even from her position, Eleanor could see some of the crowd at Martha's house turn toward the commotion. Several men, including Jenkins and his deputies, broke away from the group and ran toward the livery. Taking advantage of the confusion, Eleanor slipped around to the vestry door. As expected, it was locked. She reached up to the lintel, feeling for the key her uncle always hid there. Her fingers closed around the cold metal, and she quickly unlocked the door and slipped inside. The vestry was pitch dark, but Eleanor knew its layout intimately. She had spent countless hours here, helping her uncle prepare for services, arranging hymnals and Bibles, polishing communion plates. She moved confidently to the cabinet where ceremonial items were stored, feeling for the small key her uncle kept in a hollow Bible on the top shelf. Finding it, she unlocked the cabinet and reached for the bottom shelf, where her father's old Bible would be kept. Her fingers brushed against tooled leather, and she pulled the heavy book out carefully. A noise from the main sanctuary made her freeze, footsteps moving slowly across the wooden floor. Someone had entered the church. Eleanor clutched the Bible to her chest, her breathing shallow and controlled. The vestry's stone walls seemed to close in around her. No windows, no back exit, just a single door where the footsteps had stopped. Eleanor? The voice that called her name made her blood run cold. Blackwood's unmistakable tenor, artificially softened. I know you're in here. I watched you slip inside. She pressed herself against the wall beside the door, mind racing through impossible options. Blackwood's breathing was audible now, just inches away through the wooden panels. Your uncle believes you've run far from town, he continued, voice dripping with false concern. But I can broker peace between you. I understand youthful impulses, the desire for rebellion. The doorknob rotated with excruciating slowness. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the Bible's leather binding, its weight suddenly significant in her hands. Our arrangement can proceed as planned, Blackwood murmured, pushing the door open. Lamplight from the sanctuary cast his elongated shadow across the threshold. A forgiving husband is a gift many women never receive. As his face appeared in the doorway, that smile she'd grown to dread, Eleanor acted on pure instinct. She pivoted from her hiding spot, swinging the heavy tome in a desperate arc that connected with sickening force. The satisfying crunch of cartilage was followed by Blackwood's howl of pain and surprise as he stumbled backward, blood streaming between his fingers as they clutched at his face. Without a backward glance, Eleanor bolted past the groaning Blackwood. She raced through the sanctuary, her footsteps echoing off the high ceiling as she headed for the double doors. Ungrateful whore! Blackwood's voice transformed from honeyed persuasion to venomous rage. No one refuses me. You belong to me, Eleanor. Mine! She burst into the night air, heart pounding against the Bible pressed to her chest. Her momentary triumph evaporated as she scanned the town square. Gabriel's diversion at the livery stable had already been quelled, and townspeople were streaming back toward Martha's house, where torches illuminated an angry crowd. Halfway between stood her uncle, his tall frame unmistakable, even in the darkness. Their gazes locked across the expanse. Pierce's face contorted, recognition and fury dawning simultaneously. Eleanor! His bellow carried over the night sounds. There she is! Stop her! Abandoning their planned escape route to the mesquite grove, Eleanor fled in the opposite direction, hoping to draw pursuit away from Gabriel and Martha. Her skirts tangled around her legs as she ran, each ragged breath burning in her lungs. The slap of boots against dirt grew louder behind her, accompanied by shouts that seemed to close in from every direction. The Bible grew impossibly heavier with each desperate stride, yet she clung to it like a lifeline, knowing the precious document hidden within could shatter her uncle's control forever. A shadow detached from the darkness between two buildings ahead, stepping directly into her path. She tried to pivot, but strong hands caught her shoulders, steadying her before she could fall. "I've got you," came Gabriel's low voice, his breath warm against her ear. "You're safe." Eleanor sagged against him momentarily, relief washing through her before reality intruded again. "Pierce saw me," she managed between gasps. "The entire town. They're coming." Gabriel's expression was calm despite the danger. "Martha's already on her way to the meeting point," he said, taking the Bible and securing it inside his coat. "My horse is waiting just beyond that corner. Think you can make it a little further?" She nodded, drawing on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. Gabriel's fingers closed around hers, and together they darted through the narrow alley between buildings. They emerged in a small side yard where his massive black stallion stood tethered, pawing the ground restlessly as if sensing the urgency. With practiced efficiency, Gabriel lifted Eleanor into the saddle before vaulting up behind her in one smooth motion. His arms enclosed her as he gathered the reins. "Brace yourself," he murmured, then dug his heels into the horse's flanks. The stallion exploded forward, powerful muscles bunching as it thundered down the back street and toward the town's edge. Eleanor leaned forward instinctively, feeling Gabriel's solid presence at her back as buildings blurred past. Behind them, shouts of pursuit grew fainter, though she knew it was only minutes before her uncle would have men mounted and following their trail. They rode in tense silence until the town's lights receded to distant pinpricks in the mess darkness. Only then did Gabriel slow their pace enough to speak. "The Bible, you found it?" His breath was warm against her ear, his voice barely audible above the rhythm of hoofbeats. Eleanor nodded, suddenly remembering their purpose beyond mere escape. "Yes, though I couldn't search it for the will." Blackwood interrupted before I had the chance. "We'll examine it once we're safe," Gabriel replied, guiding the horse down a shallow creek bed where water would erase their tracks. "Right now, our priority is ensuring we're not followed." After nearly an hour of careful navigation, crossing rocky ground, doubling back, and traversing dense brush, they approached the prearranged meeting spot. Martha stood beside her mule in the shadow of the mesquite grove, her face tight with worry until she recognized them. "I feared the worst," she said, her shoulders slumping with visible relief. The commotion carried all the way from town. As Gabriel helped Eleanor dismount, her trembling legs nearly buckled beneath her. "Blackwood was lying in wait at the church," she explained, steadying herself against the saddle. "He anticipated our plan." Gabriel pulled the Bible from inside his coat, his expression grim. "We have what we came for, but we need to keep moving. By now they'll have organized search parties fanning out from Redemption Creek." With silent agreement, they remounted and set off, not toward the vulnerable line shack their pursuers might discover, but northward into the deeper wilderness where the silver-rich property in Gabriel's cabin awaited. As they traveled under the vast canopy of stars, Eleanor's thoughts kept returning to that moment in the vestry, the satisfying weight of the Bible in her hands, the shock on Blackwood's face as she struck him. For 22 years, she had absorbed her uncle's teachings that a woman's duty was submission, that defiance was the path to damnation. Yet in that singular act of resistance, something fundamental had shifted inside her. The sensation wasn't guilt or shame as she'd been conditioned to expect. It was power, liberation, a reclaiming of her own agency. She thought of the page in her mother's journal she'd read just nights before. "The desert doesn't kill those who are strong. It reveals their strength." Eleanor straightened in the saddle, feeling the outline of the Bible secured in Gabriel's coat where it pressed against her back, a physical manifestation of truth long suppressed, now racing with them toward freedom, like a tangible promise of what tomorrow might hold. They rode through the night, following the faint silver path of moonlight across the desert terrain. Gabriel led them on a circuitous route, doubling back occasionally to ensure they weren't being tracked, crossing rocky outcroppings where they would leave minimal traces. His knowledge of the land was impressive. He navigated with the confidence of someone who had studied maps meticulously or traveled this territory before. Eleanor's body ached from hours in the saddle, but she did not complain. The Bible was secured in Gabriel's saddlebag, and with it, the promise of freedom. Occasionally she glanced back, half expecting to see torches on the horizon, her uncle and his men in pursuit. But the vast desert behind them remained dark and still. As the first pale light of dawn began to streak the eastern sky, Gabriel finally reined in his horse. "We should rest the animals," he said, his voice rough with fatigue. "There's a spring ahead. We can water them and take a short break." Martha nodded wearily, her face drawn with exhaustion. Though she had not complained, the night's journey had clearly taken its toll on her. "A wise decision. We'll need our wits about us when we reach the cabin." They dismounted in a small hollow where a natural spring bubbled up from the rocky ground, creating a tiny oasis of greenery in the otherwise barren landscape. While the horses and Mo drank deeply, Gabriel surveyed the surrounding terrain with the watchful eyes of a man who had spent years looking over his shoulder. "We're about 3 hours from the cabin," he informed them, apparently satisfied that they weren't being followed. "But we need to be cautious on the approach. If they failed to find us in town, the cabin is the next place they'll look." Eleanor stretched her stiff muscles, trying to work feeling back into her legs. "Do you think they'll still be waiting for us there?" "Possibly," Gabriel acknowledged. "Jenkins has limited men, but Pierce and Blackwood are determined." His expression darkened at the mention of Blackwood. "How badly did you hurt him with that Bible?" A strange mix of guilt and satisfaction twisted in Eleanor's stomach as she recalled the sound of the heavy book connecting with Blackwood's face, the sight of blood streaming from his nose. "I don't think I broke anything," she said, "but I definitely ruined his dignity." A rare smile tugged at Gabriel's lips. "Good, though I imagine it's only made him more determined to get you back." Martha joined them after refilling their canteens. "Speaking of the Bible, shall we see what Thomas thought important enough to hide from his brother-in-law?" Gabriel nodded and retrieved the worn leather-bound book from his saddlebag. It was heavy, its pages gilt-edged and well-thumbed, the name Thomas Winters embossed in faded gold on the cover. He handed it to Eleanor. "It's your father's. You should be the one to open it." Eleanor took the Bible with reverent hands, feeling a connection to her father that transcended the years since his death. She sat on a flat rock beside the spring and carefully opened the book. As she turned the pages, she found passages underlined, margins filled with her father's neat handwriting. Observations, questions, personal reflections on the text. This was not merely a ceremonial object, but a working tool, evidence of a man who engaged deeply with his faith. "He wrestled with it," she murmured, running her fingers over a passage where her father had written a particularly heartfelt commentary. "The text, the meaning. He didn't just accept what he was told." Martha smiled gently. "Thomas was a true scholar of Scripture, not just a thundering preacher like Abraham. He believed faith should enlighten the mind, not close it." Eleanor continued turning pages, looking for anything that might resemble a will or hidden document. Near the center of the book, she found several pages that seemed thicker than the others. Examining them closely, she realized 2 pages had been carefully glued together, creating a hidden pocket. "Here," she said, excitement quickening her pulse. "There's something hidden inside." Gabriel and Martha moved closer, watching as Eleanor gently worked her fingernail between the pages, careful not to damage the fragile paper. The sealed edges gave way, revealing a folded document tucked inside the makeshift compartment. With trembling fingers, Eleanor extracted the paper and unfolded it. It was covered in her father's handwriting, dated just 2 weeks before his death, and bore the official seal of a notary public from Phoenix. "Last will and testament of Thomas James Winters," she read aloud, her voice catching with emotion. "Being of sound mind and body, I hereby revoke all previous wills and testaments." She scanned the document quickly, her eyes widening. "It names Martha as my guardian, not Uncle Abraham, and it specifically states that the northern property and any minerals found thereon are to be held in trust for me until I reach the age of 21. Gabriel's expression hardened. "Which means Pierce has been illegally acting as your guardian for 10 years, and illegally attempting to claim the northern property." "There's more," Eleanor continued, reading further. "In the event that my sister-in-law, Martha Coleman, is unable or unwilling to serve as guardian, I hereby appoint Gabriel Montana as secondary guardian, with full authority to act in my daughter's best interests." She looked up in shock, meeting Gabriel's equally surprised gaze. "Father named you as a potential guardian? But I had never even heard of you until yesterday." Gabriel looked as stunned as she felt. "He never told me this," he said quietly. I knew he trusted me with the land purchase. But this, he shook his head, seemingly at a loss for words. Martha was examining the document over Eleanor's shoulder. It's properly witnessed and notarized, she confirmed. This is a legal will, and it directly contradicts the one Abraham filed after Thomas's death. She looked up, her expression grim but satisfied. Abraham committed fraud. That's a criminal offense. Eleanor was still trying to process the implications. If this is valid, then Uncle has had no legal authority over me for the past decade. The silver mine is mine, not the church's. She looked between Martha and Gabriel. But will it be enough? Uncle has influence with the local judge, with the sheriff. Which is why we're not taking it to them, Gabriel replied, his voice firming with resolve. We're taking it to Judge Parker in the territorial capital. He's known for his integrity, and he can't be bought by the likes of Pierce or Blackwood. The mention of Blackwood brought another detail from the will to Eleanor's attention. She returned to the document, finding the passage that had caught her eye. It is my express wish that my daughter Eleanor be allowed to choose her own husband when she comes of age, and that no arrangement be made on her behalf without her full and enthusiastic consent. Tears pricked at Eleanor's eyes. Even in death, her father had tried to protect her from exactly the fate her uncle had planned for her. Had Thomas somehow foreseen Abraham's intentions? Had he worried about Blackwood's interest even before his illness? Your father was a careful man, Martha said gently, seeing Eleanor's emotion. He understood his brother-in-law better than Abraham realized. Gabriel was checking the position of the sun, his practical nature reasserting itself. We should move on, he said. We've still got rough country to cross, and we need to approach the cabin carefully. Eleanor carefully refolded the will and tucked it securely into her pocket. The Bible she returned to Gabriel's saddlebag. It was too precious to risk losing, a tangible connection to the father she was only now beginning to truly know. They mounted up again and continued their journey, spirits lifted by the discovery of the will, but still wary of the challenges ahead. The terrain grew rougher as they moved north, the flatlands giving way to rocky hills and narrow arroyos. Gabriel led them through paths that seemed barely passable, always keeping a watchful eye for signs of other travelers. As they rode, Eleanor found her thoughts returning to the revelation that her father had named Gabriel as a potential guardian. What had inspired such trust? What history existed between these two men that would lead her father to place such faith in this quiet, intense stranger? Gabriel, she ventured, breaking the silence that had fallen over their small party. How did you and my father meet? What made him trust you enough to name you in his will? Gabriel was silent for so long that Eleanor thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, meant for her ears alone. I was in a bad way when Thomas found me, he said, staring straight ahead at the trail. After the war, after my time in the mines, I took to drinking. Hard. Found myself in a cell in Phoenix, facing charges for a fight I couldn't even remember. Eleanor listened, surprised by this glimpse into his past. Thomas was visiting the jail, ministering to the prisoners. Not like your uncle, he didn't preach hellfire. He listened, talked to men like they were human beings, not just sinners. Gabriel's voice softened with remembered respect. He paid my fine, got me released into his custody, said God had told him I was worth saving. And were you? Eleanor asked quietly. A muscle tightened in Gabriel's jaw. Thomas thought so. He helped me get sober, find work again. We stayed in touch after I left Arizona. He was the closest thing to a father I'd had since losing my own. He glanced at her briefly. I never knew he'd put me in his will. Never would have asked for that responsibility. Yet here you are, Eleanor observed, honoring that responsibility even though you didn't know about it. Gabriel's expression was unreadable. I owe Thomas Winters my life. The least I can do is protect his daughter. The simple declaration stirred something in Eleanor's chest. Gratitude, certainly, but also a warmer feeling she wasn't ready to examine too closely. Before she could respond, Gabriel raised his hand in a signal to stop. We're approaching the northern border of the property, he said, his voice returning to its usual practical tone. From here, we need to be especially careful. The cabin is about a mile ahead, just beyond that ridge. They dismounted, leading the horses on foot to make less noise. Gabriel instructed them to stay low and move carefully, using the sparse vegetation as cover whenever possible. They proceeded in tense silence, every sense alert for danger. When they reached the crest of a small rise that overlooked the cabin, Gabriel motioned for them to stop and lie flat against the ground. He produced a small spyglass from his saddlebag and surveyed the scene below. The cabin was larger than Eleanor had expected, a substantial structure built of heavy logs with a stone chimney and a covered porch that wrapped around two sides. A small corral stood empty beside it, and a well had been dug nearby. It looked like a place built for permanence, not just a temporary shelter. "See anything?" Martha whispered. Gabriel adjusted the spyglass, scanning methodically. No movement, no horses in the corral or hitched outside. He continued his survey. "But the door's ajar. Someone's been here recently." "Jenkins and his men?" Eleanor asked. "Possibly, or they could still be inside, waiting." Gabriel collapsed the spyglass and turned to them. "I'll approach alone first. Make sure it's safe." Martha frowned. "That's too dangerous. If they're waiting, then better they catch one of us than all of us," Gabriel interrupted firmly. "You two stay here with the horses. If you hear gunfire, or if I don't signal that it's clear within 10 minutes, ride for the territorial capital. Don't wait, don't look back." Eleanor wanted to protest, but the logic of his plan was undeniable. Still, the thought of him facing potential danger alone twisted her stomach into knots. "Be careful," she said, echoing her words from before their mission to the church. Gabriel nodded, checking his pistol one last time. "Always am," he replied, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. Then he was gone, moving down the slope with the silent efficiency that spoke of years of experience in situations where noise meant death. Eleanor and Martha watched tensely as he approached the cabin, keeping to cover as much as possible. When he reached the edge of the clearing, he paused, listening. Then, apparently satisfied, he moved quickly across the open space to the side of the cabin, pressing himself flat against the wall beside the open door. In one swift motion, he pivoted into the doorway, gun raised. Eleanor held her breath, expecting the crack of gunfire. Instead, after a long moment, Gabriel disappeared inside the cabin. The minutes stretched endlessly as they waited for his signal. Eleanor counted heartbeats, trying to calm her racing pulse. What if it was a trap? What if Jenkins or Blackwood had somehow anticipated their arrival and were waiting inside? Just as she was about to suggest they should prepare to flee, Gabriel reappeared on the porch. He holstered his pistol and waved to them, the all-clear signal. Relief flooded through Eleanor as she and Martha led the horses down to the cabin. Gabriel met them in the yard, his expression grim. "No one's here now, but someone definitely was," he reported. "They searched the place thoroughly. Drawers emptied, furniture moved. They were looking for something." "The deed to the property?" Martha suggested. Gabriel nodded. "Most likely. Fortunately, I keep that with me." He helped Eleanor dismount, his hands lingering briefly at her waist before he stepped back. "The cabin's secure now, but we should assume they'll be back. This is the most obvious place for us to come." They led the animals to the corral, unsaddling them and providing water from the well. The horses and mule were exhausted after the long journey and immediately began to drink thirstily. Inside, the cabin showed clear signs of a hasty but thorough search. Cupboards stood open, a mattress had been partially pulled from its frame, and papers were scattered across a desk in one corner. Despite the disarray, Eleanor could see that the cabin was well built and had been comfortably furnished. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a cooking area beside it. A sturdy table and chairs occupied the center of the main room. A doorway led to what appeared to be a bedroom, and a ladder against one wall suggested a loft space above. "Did your father build this?" she asked, trying to imagine Thomas Winters, the preacher, constructing such a substantial dwelling. "No, it was here when he bought the land," Gabriel replied, beginning to restore order to the chaos. "Built by a prospector named Jenkins, no relation to your sheriff, about 20 years ago. Your father purchased it along with the property when Jenkins decided to head to California." Martha was examining the cooking area, assessing what supplies remained. "It's a good, solid place," she approved. "Defensible, if it comes to that." "Let's hope it doesn't," Gabriel said, though his tone suggested he thought it likely. "Our best chance is to rest today, then head for the territorial capital tomorrow with the will. Once it's validated by Judge Parker, Pierce's claim to guardianship will be voided." Eleanor helped Martha organize the remaining food supplies while Gabriel secured the doors and windows. Despite their precarious situation, she felt strangely at peace. For the first time since her parents' deaths, she was surrounded by people who respected her choices, who saw her as a person rather than a possession or a project. "What happens after the will is validated?" she asked as they sat at the table, sharing a simple meal of dried meat and beans that Martha had prepared. "Do we return to Redemption Creek?" Gabriel and Martha exchanged a glance. "That depends on what you want, Eleanor," Martha said carefully. "The will makes you the owner of this property, and at 22, you're legally entitled to live as you choose. You could sell the land, move to Phoenix, or even further east if you wish." The possibilities were dizzying. Eleanor had never considered a future beyond Redemption Creek, beyond the narrow path her uncle had laid out for her. "I don't know what I want," she admitted. "I've never been allowed to want anything before." Gabriel's eyes met hers across the table. "You have time to decide," he said quietly. "No one's going to rush you or choose for you anymore." The simple statement, spoken with such certainty, brought unexpected tears to Eleanor's eyes. Freedom, true freedom to choose her own path, was a concept so foreign it was almost frightening. Martha squeezed her hand gently. "One step at a time, dear. First, we secure your legal independence. Then you can consider the future." After the meal, exhaustion caught up with them. They had been traveling through the night, and the emotional strain of the past days had taken its toll. Martha claimed the bedroom, insisting that her age entitled her to the only proper bed. Gabriel prepared to sleep on a bedroll near the door, positioned, Eleanor noted, to defend against any intrusion. Eleanor herself was directed to the loft where a simple pallet had been laid out. As she climbed the ladder to her sleeping place, Eleanor realized this was the first night since leaving Redemption Creek that she would sleep truly undisturbed. No need to maintain watches, no immediate threat of pursuit. The cabin's solid walls provided a sense of security that the line shack had lacked. The loft was small but comfortable, with a window that offered a view of the surrounding countryside. From this vantage point, she could see for miles across the rugged terrain. Somewhere out there, her father had discovered silver, a discovery that had inadvertently set in motion the events that had brought her here. She removed her mother's journal from the small bag of possessions she had brought from Martha's house and opened it, finding comfort in the familiar handwriting. Her mother's detailed observations of desert plants gave way occasionally to more personal reflections. Thoughts about her marriage, her hopes for her daughter, her quiet defiance of the restrictions placed on women in their community. One passage caught Eleanor's eye. "Thomas and I spoke today about Eleanor's future. He fears Abraham's influence, fears what might happen to our daughter if she grows up believing a woman's only value lies in submission and obedience. We agreed that education must be our priority for her, not just reading and figures, but learning to think for herself, to question, to seek her own answers. Abraham would call this dangerous. We call it necessary." Eleanor traced her finger over the words. This evidence that her parents had wanted for her exactly what her uncle had denied her, the freedom to think independently, to question, to determine her own path. She fell asleep with the journal beside her, feeling closer to her parents than she had in years. A sound woke her, subtle but out of place. Eleanor lay perfectly still, listening intently. The cabin was dark, moonlight streaming through the small window indicating it was the middle of the night. Below, she could hear the soft, regular breathing of her aunt and the occasional creak of the floorboards as Gabriel shifted in his position near the door. Then she heard it again, a faint metallic click from outside, followed by the soft nicker of a horse. Someone was approaching the cabin. Eleanor slipped silently from her pallet and moved to the window, careful to stay to one side where she wouldn't be silhouetted against the glass. In the pale moonlight, she could make out figures moving cautiously toward the cabin. 3 men, leading horses to minimize noise. The moonlight glinted off a badge on one man's chest. Sheriff Jenkins. Her heart raced as she backed away from the window and moved quickly to the edge of the loft. "Gabriel," she whispered urgently, "someone's outside." He was awake instantly, hand already on his pistol as he rose silently to his feet. "How many?" he whispered back. 3. Jenkins is one of them. Gabriel moved to the window, keeping to the shadows as he assessed the situation. "Wake your aunt," he instructed. "Tell her to get dressed quickly. We may need to leave in a hurry." Eleanor climbed down the ladder and hurried to the bedroom, where Martha was already sitting up, alerted by their whispered conversation. "Trouble?" the older woman asked, reaching for her clothes. "Jenkins and two others," Eleanor confirmed, keeping her voice low. "They're approaching the cabin." Martha dressed with remarkable efficiency for a woman her age, tucking her small revolver into her belt. "What's the plan?" "Gabriel hasn't said yet, but I think we should be ready to run." They rejoined Gabriel in the main room where he was checking his rifle. "They're surrounding the cabin," he reported grimly. "One at the front, one at the back," Jenkins moving toward the side door. "Options?" Martha asked, her practical nature asserting itself even in crisis. Gabriel considered for a brief moment. "We have the advantage of shelter and surprise. They don't know we've spotted them. I can hold them off while you two escape through the bedroom window. There's enough moonlight for you to make it to the horses if you're quick." "And leave you here alone?" Eleanor protested. "No, we stay together." "Eleanor's right," Martha agreed firmly. "We're not separating. Besides, 3 against 1 are poor odds, even for a man with your skills." Gabriel looked like he might argue, but a soft thud against the side door interrupted him. "Get down," he whispered urgently, positioning himself near the window where he could see the approaching figures without being seen. Eleanor and Martha crouched behind the heavy wooden table, which Gabriel had overturned to provide cover. Eleanor's heart pounded so loudly she was certain it must be audible to the men outside. In her pocket, the will seemed to burn against her skin, the document that could end this pursuit if only they could reach the territorial capital. Jenkins' voice came through the door. "Montana, we know you're in there. Come out with the Winters girl, and no one needs to get hurt." Gabriel didn't respond, his eyes meeting Eleanor's briefly before returning to watch the window. "You're harboring a fugitive and interfering with a legal guardian's authority," Jenkins continued. "That's a serious offense. Come out now, and I'll see the judge goes easy on you." Still, Gabriel maintained his silence, motioning for Eleanor and Martha to stay low and quiet. "Have it your way," Jenkins called after a moment. "Boys, break it down." The sound of a heavy object, likely a rifle butt, thudding against the door filled the cabin. Gabriel tensed, raising his rifle to his shoulder, ready to defend them the moment the door gave way. Before the attackers could breach the entrance, a new sound cut through the night, multiple horses approaching at a gallop, accompanied by shouts and the unmistakable click of rifles being cocked. "Jenkins!" a deep voice bellowed. "Stand down, you damn fool!" The assault on the door stopped abruptly. Outside, confused voices conferred hurriedly. Gabriel moved cautiously to the other window, peering out to assess this new development. "Territorial marshals," he reported, surprise evident in his tone. "At least 4 of them, and—" He paused, squinting into the darkness. "Judge Parker himself, he actually came." Martha's expression shifted to one of satisfied vindication. "I told you Samuel would come. When a man makes a promise to protect a child, some take that oath to heart for life." Eleanor peered cautiously through a crack in the shutters, trying to glimpse this man who had been absent from her life for so long, yet apparently never forgotten his connection to her family. In the moonlight, she could make out a tall figure with a silver beard, sitting straight in the saddle despite his age, speaking with the unmistakable authority of a man accustomed to having his words obeyed. A memory flickered at the edge of her mind, a deep laugh, the smell of peppermint, being lifted high on strong shoulders. Had that been Judge Parker? Had her childhood been filled with more love and connection than her uncle had ever allowed her to remember? "Samuel always said your father saved his life once," Martha whispered, watching Eleanor's expression. "When they were young men caught in a flash flood. Thomas pulled him from the water. He swore then he'd repay the debt someday. Looks like that day has come." "I don't know, but they're confronting Jenkins and his men now." Eleanor moved closer, trying to hear the exchange outside. The newcomers had surrounded Jenkins and his deputies, weapons trained on them. The lead rider, a distinguished older man with a silver beard, was speaking in authoritative tones. "Sheriff Jenkins, you are operating outside your jurisdiction and without proper authority. Stand down immediately or I'll have you arrested for exceeding your powers and threatening citizens of this territory." "With all due respect, Judge Parker," Jenkins replied, his voice considerably less confident than it had been moments before, "I'm executing a lawful warrant for the apprehension of Eleanor Winters, who has been abducted from her legal guardian. The judge's response was immediate and firm. That warrant has been superseded. I received a telegraph from Martha Coleman yesterday evening, along with copies of documents suggesting Abraham Pierce has been fraudulently acting as guardian. Until this matter is resolved, the girl remains under the court's protection. Eleanor gasped softly. Martha had sent a telegraph? When? How? As if reading her thoughts, Martha whispered, from Silver Creek. While you and Gabriel were preparing to leave the line shack yesterday, I paid a boy to ride to the telegraph office with an urgent message for Samuel. A satisfied smile crossed her face. I've known Samuel Parker for 30 years. He was a friend to your father, and he owes me a favor from long ago. Outside, Jenkins was protesting weakly, but the marshals were already disarming him and his men. Judge Parker's voice carried clearly through the night air. You will return to Redemption Creek, Sheriff, and inform Preacher Pierce that his ward, his niece, and the property in question are all now under the jurisdiction of the territorial court. Any further attempts to assert control will be met with criminal charges. Is that understood? The defeat in Jenkins' response was evident even from inside the cabin. Yes, Your Honor. Gabriel lowered his rifle slowly, hardly believing the sudden turn of events. They're leaving, he reported, watching as Jenkins and his men mounted their horses and began to ride away, escorted by two of the marshals. The judge and the other marshals are approaching the cabin. Martha straightened her clothing, smoothing her silver hair with a practiced hand. Well, we should greet them properly. Samuel has ridden a long way on our behalf. Gabriel unbarred the door cautiously, still wary despite the apparent rescue. Outside, Judge Parker dismounted stiffly, his age evident in his movements but his bearing still commanding respect. The two marshals with him remained on horseback, alert for any sign of trouble. Martha Coleman, the judge greeted, genuine warmth in his tone as he approached the cabin. It's been too many years. Martha stepped forward to clasp his offered hand. Samuel, your timing is impeccable as always. Your telegram was quite compelling, he replied, then turned his attention to Gabriel. And you must be Montana. Thomas spoke highly of you in his letters. Gabriel nodded, still processing this unexpected intervention. Judge Parker, I'm grateful for your assistance, though I admit I'm surprised to see you so far from the capital. The judge's eyes twinkled beneath bushy white brows. When Martha Coleman sends a telegram saying Thomas Winter's daughter is in danger and her real will has been suppressed, I don't delegate. His gaze moved to Eleanor, who stood uncertainly in the doorway. And you must be Eleanor. The last time I saw you, you were barely tall enough to reach my knee. Eleanor stepped forward, feeling strangely shy in the presence of this man who had apparently known her as a child. Thank you for coming, Your Honor. We were planning to seek you out in the capital tomorrow. So Martha's message indicated, he replied kindly. I thought it prudent to meet you halfway, given the circumstances. May we come inside? These old bones don't take well to midnight rides anymore. They welcomed the judge and his marshals into the cabin, while the lawmen remained vigilant, positioning themselves at the windows to watch for any return of Jenkins or other threats. Judge Parker settled at the table, accepting a cup of coffee that Martha quickly prepared. Now, he said, getting directly to business, I believe you have a will to show me. Eleanor produced the document from her pocket. Handling it with care, she passed it to the judge. He examined it thoroughly, his expression growing ingratiatingly grave as he read Thomas Winter's final wishes. This appears entirely legitimate, he concluded, looking up at them. The notary's seal is authentic, and the witnesses are known to me. If this is indeed the last will Thomas executed, then Abraham Pierce has committed serious fraud in presenting an alternative document to the probate court. It is the last will, Martha confirmed. Thomas told me about it himself just before he fell ill. He feared Abraham might try to control Eleanor and the property if anything happened to him. A justified fear, it seems. The judge carefully refolded the document. This will need to be formally presented to the court, but given the circumstances, I'm prepared to issue a temporary ruling recognizing its validity. He turned to Eleanor, which means, young lady, that you are legally free of your uncle's guardianship, effective immediately. And as you are now of age, you have full control over your inheritance, including this property and any minerals found upon it. The simple statement, delivered with judicial authority, sent a wave of emotion through Eleanor. After 10 years of control, of having every aspect of her life dictated by her uncle's interpretation of God's will, she was free. Legally, officially free. "What about Pierce?" Gabriel asked, his practical nature asserting itself. "And Blackwood? They won't accept this easily." Judge Parker's expression hardened, a cold fury evident in his eyes. "Pierce will be summoned to appear before the court to answer charges of fraud. Blackwood as well, if there's evidence he was complicit. In the meantime, I'm placing 2 marshals here to ensure your safety until the matter is fully resolved." He set his coffee cup down with deliberate control. "What you may not know is that Abraham Pierce and I have history. Years ago, I presided over a case involving a mining accident at one of Blackwood's operations. 13 men died when a shaft collapsed. A collapse that investigations revealed could have been prevented with proper supports. Pierce testified to Blackwood's character, swayed the jury with scripture about accepting God's will. Those men never received justice." The judge's hands tightened around his cup. "I've watched Pierce use faith to shield Blackwood's greed for years, while Blackwood's money gave Pierce influence beyond his pulpit. They've created a system where each protects the other, where questioning one means challenging both. This time, they've gone too far." Martha reached across the table and placed her hand over the judge's. "Samuel, this isn't just about old grudges." "No," he conceded, his voice softening slightly. "This is about justice for Thomas and Elizabeth, and freedom for their daughter. But I won't deny their satisfaction in finally having the evidence to break their hold on this territory." He glanced at the window, where the first faint light of dawn was beginning to appear. "It's been a long night for all of us. I suggest we get some rest, and in the morning we can discuss the details of moving forward." As the judge and marshals settled in for what remained of the night, Eleanor found herself drawn to the porch. The eastern sky was lightening, stars fading as the promise of a new day approached. She stood at the railing, trying to absorb the enormity of what had happened. She was free. The property, including the silver mine, was hers. Her uncle's control was broken. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Gabriel approaching. He looked exhausted but relieved. The tension that had marked his features since she'd first met him somewhat eased. "You should rest," he said, joining her at the railing. "It's been a long few days." "I'm not sure I could sleep now," she admitted. "Everything has changed so quickly." Gabriel nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Freedom can be overwhelming when you're not used to it. Believe me, I know." Eleanor studied his profile in the growing light, the strong line of his jaw, the watchful eyes that had seen more of life's hardships than she could imagine. "What will you do now?" she asked, "now that you've fulfilled your promise to my father?" A shadow crossed his face. "I haven't decided. I have the deed to this portion of the property. I could stay, develop it as Thomas and I planned." He paused, glancing at her. "If that's what you want." The question hung between them, laden with unspoken meaning. Eleanor realized with sudden clarity that despite knowing him for only a few days, she did not want Gabriel Montana to disappear from her life. The thought of him leaving created an ache in her chest she couldn't quite name. "I think," she said carefully, "that I would like you to stay. At least until I've had time to learn about managing the property, about the silver mine." She hesitated, then added more softly, "And I'd like to hear more about my father, about the man you knew." Gabriel's expression softened, the hard lines of his face relaxing into something that might, with time, become a genuine smile. "I think Thomas would have liked that." They stood together in comfortable silence as the sun crested the horizon, bathing the desert in golden light. In the distance, a cactus wren began its morning song, greeting the new day with simple joy. 3 weeks later, Eleanor sat in the territorial courthouse in Phoenix, her hands folded in her lap as she listened to the proceedings. Martha sat beside her, a steady presence throughout the legal battle that had consumed them since Judge Parker's arrival at the cabin. Gabriel stood at the back of the room, his tall frame leaning against the wall, eyes never leaving the proceedings. On the other side of the courtroom, Abraham Pierce sat rigidly in his chair, his face a mask of righteous indignation even as the evidence of his fraud mounted around him. Blackwood was notably absent. He had fled Redemption Creek the day after Judge Parker's intervention, taking what remained of his dwindling fortune with him. Rumor had it he'd crossed into Mexico, beyond the reach of territorial law. The court finds Abraham Pierce guilty of fraud in the matter of the will of Thomas Winters, Judge Parker announced, his voice echoing in the hushed courtroom. Furthermore, the court finds sufficient evidence of neglect and abuse in his role as guardian to Eleanor Winters to warrant criminal charges. A murmur rippled through the spectators. Eleanor felt no triumph as she watched her uncle's shoulders slump, only a profound relief that justice had finally prevailed. Abraham Pierce is hereby sentenced to 2 years in territorial prison, Judge Parker continued. His position as preacher in Redemption Creek is terminated, and he is barred from serving in any official capacity in a church within this territory henceforth. As the marshals led her uncle away, he turned to look at Eleanor one last time. She expected to see hatred in his eyes, but instead found only a hollow defeat. In that moment, she realized that Abraham Pierce had never truly been the powerful figure she had feared. He had merely been a man desperately clinging to control, terrified of losing his authority. "Are you all right?" Martha asked softly, squeezing her hand. Eleanor nodded. "I'm ready to go home." The journey back to the northern property was quieter than their frantic flight 3 weeks earlier. The territorial marshals had retrieved Martha's belongings from the ruins of her house. The mob had set fire to it despite Judge Parker's intervention, and she had decided to make her home at the cabin with Eleanor, at least for the time being. As they crested the ridge overlooking the cabin, Eleanor felt a strange sense of homecoming. This place that she had never known until recently now represented everything she had gained: her freedom, her inheritance, her true family history. Gabriel had ridden ahead and was waiting for them on the porch. During the past weeks, as they had navigated the legal proceedings in Phoenix, something had shifted between them. The initial wariness had given way to mutual respect, and that respect had gradually deepened into something more. Tentative glances, lingering touches, conversations that stretched late into the night. He helped her down from her horse, his hands strong at her waist. "Welcome back," he said, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her heart beat faster. "It's good to be home," she replied, and meant it. Later that evening, after Martha had retired to her room, Eleanor found Gabriel on the porch, gazing at the stars that blanketed the desert sky. She joined him, drawing his coat more tightly around her shoulders. He had never asked for it back, and she had never offered to return it. "I've been thinking," she said, breaking the comfortable silence between them, "about the silver mine." Gabriel turned to face her, moonlight casting half his face in shadow. "And? I want to develop it as my father planned, but I don't want it to be just about profit. I want to build something that would make him proud, that would make both my parents proud." Gabriel studied her face. "What did you have in mind?" "A portion of the proceeds should go to education, a school where girls can learn more than just household management and scripture, where they can study science like my mother did." The idea had been forming in her mind ever since she had read her mother's journal, seen the depth of knowledge and passion that had been discouraged by men like her uncle. "I want to create a place where women can become more than what men like Uncle Abraham think they should be." Gabriel's smile was genuine now, no longer the ghost of an expression he had worn when they first met. "Your father would have approved wholeheartedly, and I'd be honored to help you build it." Eleanor found herself stepping closer to him, drawn by something she was only beginning to understand. "There's something else I've been thinking about," she said, her voice softer now. "What's that?" "You mentioned that marriage was the most straightforward way to ensure my legal independence." She saw his expression change, wariness returning to his eyes. "I rejected the idea then because I didn't want to trade one form of control for another." "I remember," he said carefully, "but marriage doesn't have to be about control, does it? My parents had a partnership, equals who respected each other." She drew a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I've been wondering what that might be like." Gabriel's hand came up to touch her cheek, calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "Eleanor Winters, are you proposing to me?" The teasing note in his voice couldn't quite mask the emotion beneath it. She laughed, the sound carrying across the desert night. "I'm considering it. I thought you might want some time to get used to the idea." He drew her closer, his arms encircling her waist. "I don't need time. I've known since I cut you down from that post that you were unlike any woman I'd ever met." Eleanor's hands rested on his chest, feeling the strong beat of his heart beneath her palm. "Is that a yes, then?" His answer came not in words, but in the gentle pressure of his lips against hers. Her first kiss, freely given, freely received. When they finally broke apart, the stars seemed brighter, the desert night warmer despite the chill in the air. "That's a yes," he confirmed, his voice rough with emotion. Eleanor thought of her mother's words in the journal. "The desert doesn't kill those who are strong, it reveals their strength." In the crucible of these past days, she had discovered a strength she hadn't known she possessed. The courage to defy authority, to claim her freedom, to imagine a future of her own choosing. Whatever came next, she would face it not as the obedient niece, the perfect example of feminine submission, but as Eleanor Winters, her father's daughter, a woman of independence and determination. And she would not face it alone.